Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where wonder is never in a hurry and science drifts at the pace of falling leaves. Tonight we open a quiet question, an ancient one, though it doesn't sound like the kind of question you would expect from science. It is not about data or numbers, not about measurement or proof. It is softer than that. It asks simply, what if every hunt, long before stories were written, was more than survival? What if it was a way of remembering the land itself? Before we wander together into this slow landscape, I want to ask you something very simple. Where are you listening from right now? Are you close to the wilderness where night carries the breath of trees, or in a city where silence is something rare and borrowed? Did you ever find yourself walking across an empty field, or leaning into the wind, and feeling as though the ground beneath your feet somehow knew you were there? Many of us have, though we do not always admit it. We call it imagination or daydream, but perhaps it is something more. If this kind of gentle wondering is welcome to you, I invite you to leave a small trace here. A comment, a like, a quiet signal that this little corner of calm has reached you. It helps us keep building a place where nothing is rushed, nothing loud, and nothing ever asks for more than you wish to give. Now, let us step into a time before clocks, before writing, before even villages. The world then was wide and full of silence. For early humans, to hunt was to live, and to live was not a separate thing from remembering. The hunt was not only the pursuit of an animal, it was the pursuit of patterns, shapes, echoes. When a hunter leaned down to touch a footprint in soft mud, they were not just reading a sign of where an animal had gone. They were touching geology in motion, a living record pressed into soil that had been shaped by rivers for thousands of years. In a way, the earth itself was offering a memory, and in reading it, humans entered into conversation with time. The body carried memory too. Breath was measured not in minutes, but in distances tracked across the open plain. Every muscle held the imprint of persistence, every stride recalling hunts of fathers and mothers before. To exist in this time meant to feel the land as extension of the self. Rocks, winds, shadows, and silence. All of these shaped how survival could be written into the body. If you look closely at fossilized bones marked by stone tools, you see tiny signatures of this remembering. Cuts made not randomly but with practiced patterns, repeating across time, echoing strategies so refined that they became a kind of ancestral handwriting. The bones remember, even when the voices have gone. We sometimes think of survival as desperate, but perhaps it was not always frantic. Perhaps it was slow. There is evidence that endurance, not speed, defined the earliest hunts. Our ancestors were not built like lions made for quick violence. They were built for patience, for persistence, for carrying water in skin bags and walking beneath the unflinching sun until the boundary between themselves and the earth blurred into one rhythm. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes. The steady footfall, the heartbeat, the distant shift of grasses in the wind. Time slowed, and memory deepened. Is it possible that the hunt was never just about an animal, but about finding a way to belong? The careful study of footprints taught lessons about weight and movement. The curve of antlers taught geometry as clear as anything found in stones. Fire, when spread across a field, was not chaos but choreography. Humans directing entropy, reshaping the flow of life with sparks born from the earth's own veins of flint. Each act was both immediate and eternal, an improvisation and a memory passed forward. And still, something quieter lingers in the question. What did they feel when the hunt ended? Not all hunts were successful. Sometimes the animal slipped away, carrying its shadow forever beyond reach. Did that failure become a kind of story, remembered not with shame but with humility? The land itself must have seemed endless, and yet, in those moments, it spoke with small details. Broken twigs, disturbed soil, a faint heat left on the stone. To hunt was to notice, and to notice was to become part of the planet's unfolding memory. The hunt itself was cyclical. Animals moved with seasons, following water, following grass. To follow them meant learning climate, learning geology, learning the subtle turning of sky and soil. Our ancestors, without knowing, were already scientists, tracing isotopes in water through intuition, following wind shifts with bone-deep memory. They were studying without instruments because their very lives depended on attention. What if this attention was the first philosophy? Not temples, not writings, but survival itself as sacred practice? And maybe, if we lean into that thought, it begins to soften the way we see ourselves. Because still today, each of us reads signs in the world around us. We follow clouds, we listen for silence, we wonder about echoes, even if unconsciously. Hunting has never really left us. Only its forms have changed. The act of searching, of longing, of remembering the land through our bodies, that still lives in us somewhere. And yet, if every hunt was a memory, then each memory must have come with its own shadow. What happens to a memory when the herd disappears, when the last trace of hoof or antler fades away? Could it be that the earth itself keeps what we have forgotten, holding the silence of lost hunts inside stone and soil? We may not know the answer, but those questions guide us to the edge of something deeper. Because if stone tools carved into fossilized bone represent memory of what was captured, then the shapes of herds walking across a valley represent memory of what was let go. And if this much can be remembered by Earth, if this much has survived across millennia, then we have to wonder, in the quiet of night, what else has already been lost. The plains open before us like a sea of grass, endless and breathing, its horizon drawn thin and pale beneath the weight of the sky. Here, survival did not come in sudden bursts of speed, but in the stillness of watching, in the long patience of eyes trained to recognize the faintest movements across distance. Early hunters stood in this vastness with no walls, no shelter, only the curve of land and the leaning of wind as companions. To live here was to become an instrument, tuned carefully to shifts in shadow, to the quiet alteration of light that revealed whether the figure ahead was predator, prey, or kin. Imagine a herd faintly visible on the horizon, shapes wavering with the heat. To us it might seem only a blur, uncertain and soft, but to hunter eyes it was pattern, intention, timing. The tilt of a head revealed whether an animal was grazing or preparing to run. The way dust lifted against the air revealed their numbers. Distance was not only measured in steps, but in patience, waiting long enough for the shadows to lengthen, to see which tracks thickened and which dissolved. With no binoculars, no instruments, the body itself became the telescope, memory the only map. This way of seeing was not only physical, it was geological in its slowness. Wind had already carved lines through the grass, and those lines carried information, telling where animals had once passed. Soil had already compressed under countless hooves, becoming a darkened stripe across the plain that indicated the path of migration. Even the angle of the sun was guidance, a clock by which direction was set. To hunt in such an environment was to learn how the earth itself tells time, how shadow and soil become as much tools as any carved stone. And there was always the ambiguity of distance. Was the motion far ahead a predator, crouched in the grass, or prey slipping along the edge of vision? Shadows carried uncertainty, demanding caution, demanding quiet. Every decision was an equation written in silence. If we follow, what do we risk? If we wait, what might we lose? The plains did not offer answers quickly. They required stillness, long hours of watching, hearts moving as slowly as the seasons themselves. Perhaps this is where humans began to develop another kind of perception, the blending of the mind with landscape. To survive, they could not separate themselves from the world around them. Each gesture of the wind, each flicker of light on grass became part of perception. Maybe this is the root of memory itself, not just storing images, but learning to see connections across what is visible and what is hidden. The silhouette became story. The shadow became clue. When we look into fossil records of these ancient grasslands, we find bones marked by both predator and human tools. Antelope, horse, bison, each species leaving behind traces of its passage. Through isotope analysis, we know migration stretched across enormous distances, following the ebb and pull of climate cycles. Hunters were not only trailing animals, they were tracking time itself, moving with drought and rain, guided by shadows stretched thin upon the earth. In the stillness of their waiting they were, in a sense, studying physics with their bodies, adjusting to refraction, light, distance, and movement long before such words existed. What if the gift of these planes was not only food, but sight? The training of perception as something deeper than vision, something closer to awareness. Here, small differences mattered. A shadow moving against the direction of the grass revealed danger. A line holding steady for an hour revealed rest. To see was to feel, to listen, to interpret silence. Not because survival demanded brilliance, but because Earth demanded attunement. And so, we inherit this long memory in our own eyes. The way we still notice a sudden movement at the edge of vision. The way we sense being observed even in quiet rooms. Echoes of these planes remain in us still. They are, perhaps, reminders of when every shadow was a potential story, and every horizon demanded patience. And yet, if hunters once learned to survive by deciphering shadows stretched thin over the open plains, what might they have learned when the horizon closed in, when stone walls and valleys offered new kinds of echoes to guide their pursuit? The horizon does not end. It only stretches wider and wider until distance itself becomes the true opponent. This was the setting of persistence hunting, a practice not of sudden violence, but of patience carried to its utmost limit. To chase an animal across miles of land was not about outrunning it in the swiftness of a moment. It was about outlasting it, letting time itself become the tool, and letting the body transform into a mathematics of endurance. In those long pursuits, the hunt was not defined by who was faster, but by who could keep moving, and who would eventually collapse under the weight of heat, dust, and exhaustion. Imagine the scene. An antelope bursts forward, swift as breath, its body tuned to escape. The chase begins, but the hunters do not sprint. Their pace is measured, steady, relentless. The animal sprints until heat blooms in its muscles, then pauses, then sprints again. Each surge of speed raises its body temperature closer to the dangerous threshold of collapse. By contrast, the human body was crafted by evolution to endure. Skin finely tuned to release heat through sweat, legs stretched for spring and length, lungs capable of longer, slower rhythms. Step by step, hour by hour, this balance of physiology becomes a living equation written in muscle, bone, and breath. Science helps us see this clearly. The reason prey fell was not a matter of will, but of thermodynamics. Humans are among the rare creatures whose cooling systems are external, pores and sweat easing heat from the body into the air, a flowing exchange with wind and climate. Animals built for speed carry fur and insulation that trap heat, so every run is also a gamble against overheating. In its sprinting, the prey is burning time, shortening its window. Meanwhile, the hunter's slower pace allows the body to stabilize, to recover even while moving. Persistence hunting is not spectacle. It is repetition, an algorithm of patience. Each round is predictable. Chase, recover, resume. Chase, recover, resume, until the prey falters. And so, the mathematics of persistence reveals itself in every breath. Think of it. Time becomes the calculation, body heat the variable, endurance the answer. Not a calculation of numbers, but of rhythms. And perhaps this is why the hunters did not need tools as complex as traps or precision weapons during such hunts. Their tools were already inside themselves. The human body became the living instrument of entropy, slowly pushing an animal beyond its limits until collapse was inevitable. But beyond biology, there is something else to consider. Persistence hunting shaped not just the muscles, but the mind. In order to wait for hours, to follow footprints over long distances, hunters had to carry focus. Every step demanded awareness of trails, cracks in dust, shifts in wind direction. A mistake could lose the path. Endurance was not only physical, it was cognitive and active memory and prediction. Which direction will the animal flee next? How long has it rested? Where does water pull it on such a day? Each assumption was its own hypothesis, tested silently against the landscape. To hunt in this way was to train in observation, to attune thought to the quiet signals of geology and atmosphere. We find evidence of these hunts not in dramatic paintings, but in subtle traces. Fossil bones marked by cuts suggest long-distance chases where animals fell in exhaustion, too weak to resist. Isotopes preserved in those bones tell of stress in migration, the wear of seasons when food was scarce, when bodies were already fragile. To think of this is to realize how deeply entwined the persistence hunt was with climate cycles themselves. A period of warmer air meant greater heat burden upon prey. A shift in rainfall meant harder paths ahead, with longer distances between watering holes. Hunters were not merely chasing, they were moving in tandem with deep time patterns. Weather, earth chemistry, astronomical tilts that altered seasons. What if, then, the persistence hunt was not only survival but an unwitting practice of reading entropy? By engaging time directly, stretching effort across hours, they became mathematicians of endurance, long before mathematics was given symbols. They carried with them the unspoken equation. Step by step, the prey's reserves decline, while ours hold steady. Minute by minute, its breathing grows shallow, while ours remains tolerable. The line of probability bends toward inevitability, and the slow certainty of collapse approaches. Perhaps this is why persistence remains one of humanity's deepest metaphors. We speak often of endurance, of resilience in the face of difficulty. Yet the origins of such ideas may stretch back not to abstract thought, but to lived hunts across grasslands. The landscape itself taught this lesson: keep moving, not faster but longer. Like rivers carving valleys, like glaciers shaping stone. Persistence, not every hunt was a chase. Sometimes, survival was built from patience, from careful thought woven quietly into the land itself. Beneath the open sky, the ground became more than surface. It became instrument, canvas, and collaborator. Early hunters understood that the earth could be shaped, persuaded, rearranged into hidden passages of survival. Pits carved into soil, snares stretched between wooden stakes, and fences of branches that funneled animals into imagined corridors. These were strategies not of speed, but of waiting. The traps themselves were silent teachers, blending geology and ingenuity, whispering that the earth could be asked to assist. Imagine a pit, disguised in grass, its sides carefully steepened, lined perhaps with stone or sharpened stakes. To the animal, nothing unusual appears, only the pull of a familiar trail, the scent of water or forage beyond. Yet beneath each step waits geometry itself. Slope angles that resist escape, depth carefully measured so strength is no longer useful. When the earth gives way, it is not confrontation, but surrender. The hunt is already complete before the hunter appears, patience having already done the work. In such moments, human survival was less pursuit, more architecture, a merging of instinct and geology. These methods were not random. They required an intimate reading of terrain. Where soil was soft enough to dig, where bedrock lay hidden just beneath, where herds most often crossed, land itself decided whether a trap was possible. Hunters learned to see not just animals, but the stability of slopes, the way rain might erode edges, the way shadows might conceal or reveal structure. The act of trapping was as much about predicting geology over time as it was about predicting movement of prey. An unnoticed crack in the soil, an unexpected rainfall, could undo hours of preparation. Nothing here was simple repetition. Every trap was negotiation. And yet, there is poetry in this slow patience. Instead of racing across the plains, hunters became sculptors of the earth. Their survival was tied to knowing how long grasses grew, how roots concealed weakness, how the subtle pressure of footsteps wrote lines across dust. The trap was both hidden and present, an invisible geometry that only revealed itself at the final moment. We might think of these as weapons, but perhaps they were closer to stories written in soil, waiting for the final sentence to be read. Fossil records hold faint echoes of these strategies. Bones found clustered at cliff edges suggest driven hunts. Animals herded toward drop-offs, their momentum used against them. In other places, evidence of post holes in the ground reveals narrow fencing that once guided movement like living rivers of wood. Archaeologists read these traces the same way hunters once read trails, patterns emerging in subtle lines of earth and scarred stone. What remains is more than evidence of food. It is evidence of thought, quiet, patient design, preserved long after the hunters themselves faded into silence. Could it be that these traps were not only physical but philosophical? They suggest a willingness to let time carry the burden, to surrender control to patience. Perhaps this was more than survival. Perhaps it was recognition that human endurance did not always mean pursuit. Could also mean stillness, waiting for the earth itself to make the decision. The trap is proof that skill is not only force but foresight, not only speed but design. Even now, the idea lingers in us. We do not always chase what we seek. Sometimes we wait, creating conditions where answers emerge on their own, where silence does the work. Not because we are passive, but because patience is also power. The same lesson lies beneath the ancient pits of hunters and the eroded fences of forgotten plains. Survival often belonged to those who trusted time, those who let gravity, slope, and silence become allies. And if patience could guide animals toward surrender, if the earth itself could become a hunter's quiet partner, then we must ask what other echoes lie hidden beneath the surface. For if traps could be disguised corridors of inevitability, might there be other kinds of wisdom still waiting beneath the soil? What else lies underfoot, written into stone, waiting to guide us still? In the quiet of deep time, before written words and before songs, there was stone. It had always been there, folded into the skin of the earth, pressed beneath oceans, buried beneath mountains. Long before human hands struck their first tools, rocks carried timelines far older than memory could hold. Flint, obsidian, chert, each fragment was the material echo of volcanoes, of ancient seas compressed into silence, of minerals rearranged by fire and pressure. And yet, when touched by human hands, when fractured carefully with persistence and vision, these stones transformed. They became sharp, purposeful, alive with intent. It was as though the geology of the planet itself was given voice through a blade. A napper sits by a fire, taking one stone against another. A strike here, a shear of pressure there, the angle precise, the outcome deliberate. What breaks is not chaos, it is design hidden in fractures. With every flake removed, the stone surrenders its geometry, revealing edges that glimmer with both danger and beauty. The simplicity of it is deceiving. It looks like destruction, but in truth it is mathematics applied through touch, physics learned not with chalk on boards but with skin, pressure, and patience. Human ingenuity discovered, perhaps without ever naming it, that stone could remember the strike. Each crafted edge was geological time aligned with human purpose. What is remarkable is not only the sharpness of these tools, but the memory they carry. A flint point is evidence of fire, of hands, of hunger, of vision. The obsidian blade gleams because volcanic eruptions shaped it, but it is sharp because survival demanded it. In a single tool lies a chain of time. Eruptions spilling molten rock millions of years ago, cooling into glass, eventually lifted by erosion, found by eyes that knew what to look for, and finally fractured into purpose. Every arrowhead, every knife, every flake of chipped stone is less a tool and more a fossil of thought, proof that we recognized ourselves not only as walkers of the earth, but as shapers of it. Archaeologists find these objects even now, scattered across plains, fields, riverbanks. Some are simple flakes, some are masterpieces of symmetry so perfect they could still cut, thousands of years after they were abandoned. They sit where they fell when hands released them, where tasks ended, or where lives ended beside them. To study them is to look into a window of thought, into how humans chose to see opportunity in the stubborn stillness of rock. These tools are the messages of ancestors who did not need language to explain, who let stone carry forward their survival, their craft, their ingenuity. Isotopes, visible only with modern instruments, reveal where the rock came from. Sometimes a blade found in one continent matches quarries hundreds of miles away. Obsidian, volcanic and fragile, traveled across valleys and mountains, exchanged between groups as both tool and treasure. Each piece tells a story not only of survival but of connection, of memory carried along trade routes that vanished into prehistory. An object made to kill an animal also became a fragment of community, of migration, of a shared human story bound to the earth itself. Could it be that, in shaping stone, humans were doing more than solving the problem of hunger? Perhaps they were also answering another impulse, the need to belong to time itself. To hold a knife of obsidian was to hold eruption, pressure, silence, fire. To press a flint point against an animal's hide was to connect survival to the hidden cycles of minerals, tectonics, and entropy. Not consciously, perhaps, but almost spiritually, as though every strike of stone against stone was also a hymn to the deep time beneath their feet. When we think of memory, we often look to language, stories, or art. Yet the chipped surface of a spear point may hold a memory even older than these. Each object preserves the knowledge of those who made it, not in words, but in form, in repetition. Knappers copied the hands they saw before them, just as those hunters had copied others, a chain stretching back into shadows. A stone tool remembers its strikes long after voices are gone. The tool survives the hand survives the body returns to soil, and yet the tool remains. Could this be why we still find them, still whisper at their sharp edges as though they carry something more than utility? The stones speak quietly, if we listen. They tell us that survival was not merely endurance but foresight, that humans learned not only to run, but to transform the raw, the static, into instruments of change. They tell us that the earth does not forget easily. It holds record in the places we least expect. Even the smallest flake, overlooked by its maker, may one day reveal an entire world of lost intention. And if stone remembers so clearly, preserving even the smallest gesture of a strike, then we must wonder about the other traces we leave behind. For if every tool is a message from the deep past, perhaps every footprint, every fire pit, every shard of dust on the ground is also memory, waiting quietly in the soil. And so the question drifts forward. If stone remembers the strikes that shaped it, what else might the ground remember about us? The quiet travelers who once followed shadows across the plains and laid their stories, silently, into earth itself? On the surface, a footprint may seem like nothing more than an impression. A shallow hollow in mud, a faint curve on a patch of sand, a pressed pattern in morning snow. Yet to ancient hunters, that small mark was an entire sentence written by the earth. Each track was a form of memory, a moment the land itself recorded without intention. To read it was to step into dialogue with silence, to slip into a language without words. The soil carried secrets, and human eyes slowly learned to listen. A hunter kneels at dawn, brushing fingers across damp ground. He notices how the edges of a hoofprint hold dew, how the weight of the step pressed deeper on one side than the other. Was the animal carrying an injury? Was it slowing, tiring, moving hesitantly? Every detail revealed information, not because the land spoke in human terms, but because time spoke through erosion, through the way moisture lingers or vanishes, through the way cracks spread outward as the surface dries. To read a track was to read time unfolding across a silent page. In grasslands, tracks might be faint grooves of flattened blades, bent just enough to catch the sun at a different angle. Across sand, footprints were more fragile, soft ridges smoothed by wind, with sharper impressions still clinging to the memory of last night's passing. Snow was a different kind of storyteller, one that melted even as it revealed. To see a hoofprint crisp and unblurred was to know the herd had passed not long before. To see edges softening back into whiteness was to know the moment had already drifted into memory. Each surface, mud, sand, snow, was both record and eraser, teaching that nothing lasts unless noticed quickly, carefully, with attentive patience. Science tells us that these readings were not guesswork. Soil carries within it a record of compression. The more pressure an animal exerts, the more particles of earth pack beneath it, creating subtle differences in density. Modern forensics confirm what ancient hunters knew by instinct. Moisture, angle, and layering reveal timing. Tracks are physical imprints of physics itself, where force meets ground. To hunters, this level of perception was survival. It allowed them to sense freshness, to follow, to anticipate. The ground gave away more than direction. It revealed stories of hesitation, of speed, of cycles of rest. But beyond detail lies mystery. To follow a trail across long distances is to feel tethered to another life, to sense its choices and fears without ever seeing it. This was persistence retold in footprints, patience extended into vision. Each depression in earth might carry a faint tremor of the animal's mood. Calm steps when feeding, frantic splay when startled into a run. To walk behind was to feel the rhythm of another being, to see not just where it had gone, but how it experienced the world in those moments. Footprints fossilized in ancient sediments still speak to us. We have found trails of animals marching side by side, families pressed into stone tens of thousands of years ago. We have found fossilized human footsteps tracking giant mammals, reminding us that tracking was not invention, but inheritance, the body remembering its role as interpreter of the ground. Even now, when we study layers of rock and trace isotope lines through sediments, we are still reading tracks, larger ones, slower ones, written across eons rather than over days. The Earth has always been tracking itself, and we have always been among its readers. Could it be, then, that the language of tracks was more than survival? Perhaps it was also philosophy, one that quietly insisted. Every presence leaves an impression, even if fleeting. Not because we intend to leave signs, but because matter remembers, however briefly. Hunters read those memories, learned to place themselves inside them, and carried the lesson forward into what we now call awareness. The faintest mark in dust or snow was a reminder that existence is never fully hidden. The world records itself, if only for those who pause long enough to look. And yet, if the ground itself could speak in the fleeting language of prints, how much louder must fire have spoken when humans turned flame itself into strategy? Fire has never belonged to us. Long before humans learned to guard it, it lived in the world as something untamed. Lightning cracking against dry forests, volcanoes spilling molten stone, embers carried on the breath of wind. It was geology in motion, chemistry rearranging itself in red glow and ash. And yet, at some moment, quiet and uncertain, humans stepped close enough to realize that what seemed uncontrollable could also be persuaded, guided, partnered with. From warmth and light, fire became something else. A silent weapon, a tool not of pursuit but of influence, shaping the movements of animals as surely as rivers or winds. Imagine the slow preparation of a hunt. The plains lie open, the grass brittle beneath the sun. Hunters know that when flame touches such land, it feeds quickly, building smoke that rolls low and steady. They do not set fire to destroy, at least not fully, but to redirect. A patch ignites and animals turn away, pressing toward safer zones, toward paths carefully chosen by waiting humans. The fire does not chase. It nudges. The smoke does not scream. It whispers. No spear has yet fallen, yet the hunt has already shifted in the balance of probabilities. This transformation was subtle, but profound. Fire stitched itself into strategy as softly as a hand reshaping clay. It did not strike animals with edges the way stone tools did. Instead, it altered space itself, painting a corridor of fear, making one path impassable and another inviting. A herd that once had countless choices suddenly had few. In this narrowing of movement, humans became architects of survival, arranging not just weapons in the hand, but the very conditions of the landscape. Perhaps, in this moment, humanity first became choreographer rather than only participant, turning entropy into ally. Geology lies at the root of this story. Fire begins in carbon, in cellulose, in the ancient remains of photosynthesis. The grasses of the savannas had already stored seasons of sunlight. When flame released that energy, it was simply returning the light, scattering it back into the atmosphere as heat, as ash. Yet hunters threaded meaning into that cycle. They turned photosynthesis and combustion into extension of will. Behind smoke was not only chemistry, but intention. A simple gesture, 2 stones struck, a spark coaxed into tinder, the careful tending of flame, was enough to fold millions of years of planetary memory into one single moment of strategy. Science gives us glimpses of how transformative this relationship was. Fire clears land, encouraging fresh growth. It changes habitats, bringing animals to graze where ash has enriched the soil. In pushing prey with flame, hunters were not only guiding the chase, they were reshaping ecosystems. The controlled burns we see recorded in archaeology, char layers buried beneath soil, blackened horizons in stratigraphy, are proof of intention. They tell us that fire was not an accidental companion. It was deliberate design, carried forward across generations, a shared knowledge as vital as stone blades and tracking skills. And fire's silence lay in this. It killed rarely with its own touch. Death came later after choices closed, after herds shifted into vulnerable places. The weapon was not flame itself but inevitability, entropy wearing the mask of strategy. Is it possible, then, that the hunters understood not only the power of fire but its philosophy? To burn was to accept that all things pass into ash. To guide prey with smoke was to borrow the truth that endings are unavoidable. Maybe each fire they set was an echo of deeper cycles, that everything, even stone, would eventually melt, erode, scatter. Yet fire was also companionship. Around the hunt it became warmth, protection, the orange flicker that let stories grow in darkness. Its duality was never lost. Both destroyer and preserver, both threatening and safe. Hunters knew this balance instinctively. When harnessed with care, flame was never loud. It moved slowly, sometimes invisibly, until it reshaped the very options the world allowed. We still live with this paradox of control. Wildfires move across continents, reminding us that fire has never been ours fully. Yet the spark in a hearth or the engineered burns of managed land show that the old relationship persists. Beneath it lingers the memory of those first hunters who saw in flickering light not only survival, but design, the realization that landscape itself could be rewritten. And if fire could be turned from chaos into choreography, if hunters could bend geological energy into silence and strategy, then we must wonder, what happened when silence itself became the tool, when they learned to wait for the cold calculations of ice and snow to guide their chase? The cold has always been a teacher. In the age of ice, when valleys were filled with silence and the air itself felt heavy with frost, survival meant listening not just to the body, but to the patterns locked within snow and stone. Here, hunters did not sprint across open plains beneath the heat of the sun. Their world was quieter, sharper, sculpted by glaciers that creaked in their slow retreat and winds that carved edges on every hill. In this frozen landscape, the hunt was not speed but patience, not abundance but calculation. Every movement was measured, every choice weighed against the mathematics of scarcity. Snow was not simply backdrop. It was recorder, memory, witness. A herd's passing left lines of compressed white, its steps writing a temporary script across the surface. Hunters could read depth and freshness, could tell if weight shifted unevenly, if an animal stumbled, or if the herd had stood gathered too long and then dispersed suddenly. Ice preserved hesitation in ways sand never could. One misstep frozen in detail, geometry of a moment carried forward for days. To follow these marks was to read history written not in words but in texture, in compression, in the faintest glimmer of disturbed crystals under light. Cold forced ingenuity in ways warmth never demanded. Carcasses could be preserved, but reaching them was harder. Tools chipped from flint grew brittle under frost. Sinew stiffened, fires were reluctant to catch in damp air. Hunters became not only chasers of prey but improvisers against elements. They allowed the silence to work for them, knowing the way sound carried differently on still, frozen nights, or how the crunch beneath their own footsteps must be softened if they wished to approach unseen. Even breath became participation in strategy, white clouds giving away presence unless stilled, slowed, hidden beneath trees. The animals, too, carried the marks of cold. Migrations were longer, more dangerous, dictated by layers of ice that opened or closed river valleys. Fossil isotopes tell us of winters of hunger, of leaner seasons when prey bodies bore signs of stress, when bone and tooth reveal the weight of exhaustion before the hunt even began. Hunters learned to predict these weakness cycles, to follow the larger mathematics that ice and climate expressed. To them, the frozen chase was not only pursuit of an animal. It was negotiation with an entire system: temperature, scarcity, fatigue, all shifting pieces of a game that required both patience and foresight. What makes these hunts feel almost mythic is how inseparable they were from deep-time forces. A glacier advancing in one epoch changed migration corridors for tens of thousands of years. A shift in climate tilted entire ecosystems toward famine or fertility. Hunters lived inside these immense cycles without ever measuring them, yet their very survival depended upon an instinctive reading of their language. The frozen chase was not a local act. It was participation in cycles written by the planet itself, cycles that modern science now reads in trapped bubbles of ancient air, in the ratios of oxygen isotopes sealed within ice cores. The hunters may not have known the numbers, but they knew the feeling of scarcity etched into their bodies, into every long pursuit. Is it possible that in such glacial cold, humanity learned another lesson, that life is profoundly linked to waiting? Not because they desired stillness, but because the land required it. Scarcity does not allow for endless trial. Patience became the wiser path, silence became weapon, and timing itself was the truest ally. Maybe this explains why we carry, even now, an unease in endless winter landscapes. They remind us of how fragile life once was, how carefully every step had to be measured against the cold. And yet, in the snow, there was also strange clarity. Every hesitation was preserved longer, every boundary of failure etched into the surface. Success was not about stealth or violence alone. It was about becoming mathematicians of time, predicting when cold itself would break the strength of prey, when fatigue would flow faster than speed. Through snow, the chase was never only against animals. It was against entropy itself, against hunger's quiet insistence, against time's long shadow cast across a frozen horizon. And if cold could become companion and adversary in equal measure, shaping every choice, then one must wonder about the other forces early hunters carried with them into survival. For as ice tested their patience, it was the simple act of a thrown spear that revealed an entirely different kind of calculation. A geometry not on the ground, but in the air itself. A spear leaves the hand, and in that instant, something ancient and unseen begins to unfold. The release is both fragile and monumental, a gesture at once ordinary and cosmic. The arc is written not only in the strength of muscle, but in the physics of air, in the mathematics of angles, in the patience of practice carried forward through generations. The hunter feels it as instinct, but behind that instinct is geometry, balance, and quiet equations that whisper through the body without ever needing language. Each throw was survival sharpened into distance, a moment suspended between science and hope. When we think of a spear, we think of sharpened stone attached to wood, yet it is also a collaboration with time itself. The wood carries years of growth, the rings of memory recorded in its fibers. The point of flint or obsidian carries deep time, carved from minerals born of fire and pressure long before humans walked. Wrapped together with sinew and trust, the spear becomes more than tool. It is a message passed between the body and the world. And when it leaves the hand, the earth decides whether the message will find its mark. Trajectories are hidden forms of memory. The hunter's arm has rehearsed the motion countless times, practicing long before the animal appears. Shoulders and muscles remember their own geometry without thought. How to angle upward to meet a moving target. How to shift weight so that velocity gathers through the whole body, not just the hand. The mathematics of persistence turns into physics of the sky. Even the air carries a role, resistance slowing the shaft, invisible currents bending its path, gravity bowing its flight gently downward. In every throw, the hunter is writing upon the canvas of space. Each arc is both predictable and uncertain. Each release, regardless of outcome, is a study in time. Archaeology preserves echoes of these throws. Spears buried in sediment, sharpened points found lodged deep within bones of mammoth or bison, reveal the force and precision achieved through repetition. Some points shattered inside ribs, fragments still clinging millennia later. Isotopes extracted from those same bones remind us where prey once roamed with water and grasses marking their passage. To imagine a spear striking such an animal is to witness convergence. human ingenuity intersecting with cycles far larger and older. The curve of stone flight joins the curve of seasons, joins the tilt of Earth, joins gravity's endless pull. The act was never simply mechanical. To throw was to hope, to trust time in the air to carry something forward. One brief moment stretched across distance, an uncertainty measured in heartbeats. Hunters knew failure well. Many throws fell short, skimmed past, or broke upon stone. Yet even in those failures, a rhythm was being learned. Every miss was also memory, another chance to refine calculations, to prepare for the next throw. In this way, the spear's path was as much about teaching as about killing. The body learned physics not through numbers, but through endless conversation with distance itself. Could it be that, in the spear's flight, humans were also encountering ideas of fairness, even fate? Once released, the spear was no longer under control. It became part of movement larger than intention, subject to forces indifferent to hunger or need. That moment of letting go was perhaps also philosophical. Recognition that control is never absolute, that the world must always finish what we begin. To throw was to hand survival over to chance, to gravity, to silence. And still, hunters kept throwing generation after generation, refining instinct until instinct resembled science itself. Even today, when we measure parabolas and projectiles on chalkboards, we echo that same ancient geometry already etched into the memory of bodies long gone. The turn of an arm, the grip of fingers, the push of shoulder, they are the origins of physics, living in muscle long before they were written in symbols. Our equations now remember what our ancestors once lived wordlessly. The spear was more than skill. It extended reach across time. With every throw, hunters carried the knowledge of their elders, the touch of those who had shaped the weapon, the echoes of countless hunts that had come before. A single throw was not just one moment. It was continuity, the weight of memory arcing through air, binding past to present in one fragile hope for the future. And as we follow that arc through deep time, we must ask, if distance itself could be crossed with stone and wood, what other landscapes of sound and space became part of strategy? For beyond plains and valleys, there were cliffs and walls where echoes carried voices, where the chase was guided not by sight alone, but by listening to stone. Stone has always had its own kind of voice, not one of words or melody, but of resonance, of echo. Along the edges of cliffs and canyons, where rock rose suddenly from the plain like frozen waves, hunters found both danger and opportunity. These walls of stone carried memory, not only in their layers of sediment and fossilized shells, but in the way sound lingered and returned, in the way footsteps transformed into reverberations that filled space. To hunt here was to step into a theater shaped by geology, where every call, every shout, every strike of rock against rock came back magnified, guiding animals in ways no spear or pit alone could. Imagine a herd driven slowly toward the narrowing edge of a plateau. Open space begins to close as cliffs rise around them, turning freedom into passage, passage into boundary. The animals hesitate, sensing confinement, but sound shifts their understanding. A cry released by hunters tumbles against walls of stone, doubling, tripling, becoming larger than it is. The herd startles, as though surrounded, as though voices come from places unseen. The cliff becomes collaborator. The geography itself joins the hunt, bending not only movement but perception. Geology reveals its silent role. Cliff faces are remnants of tectonic motion, ancient seabeds lifted high, their layers stacked like forgotten ledgers of time. Within these walls lie traces of ocean creatures, of coral and shell pressed into limestone, of volcanic ash turned to basalt, memories of eras when the land was ocean. Now these same walls shape air itself, turning sound into structure. Hunters may not have known the chemistry of minerals, the thickness of sandstone, or the density of granite, but they knew its consequence. The uncanny way a single human voice could sound like many, the way stone could herd without touch. It was not only echo that mattered, but the edge itself. Cliffs provided finality, a place where momentum betrayed the animal's strength. Some were driven too far, pushed toward drop-offs where escape became impossible. Fossil evidence and carved bones at cliff bases tell us of mass kills. Buffalo and bison cascading downward in ancient drives, their stories ending in sudden collisions of bone and gravity. In those places, stone bore witness, recording in layers of sediment both the violence of impact and the silence that followed. To stand at the base of such walls now is to stand inside memory itself, as though the very ground recalls the thunder of hooves, the sudden end of breath. And yet there was patience, too. Hunters did not always need to push. Often the rock itself provided concealment. A body hidden against shadow, a figure merging with stone, made the trap more effective. Cliffs amplified not just sound, but stillness. Echoes guided when needed, silence held when necessary. It was a dual strategy, knowing when to speak and when to let geology whisper on its behalf. Could it be that cliffs shaped not only the hunt, but also the earliest understanding of presence and absence? To hear a voice that was not there, to sense bodies multiplied by returning echo, was to learn that the world was larger than it appeared. In those amplified moments, hunters may have glimpsed something we would now call mystery. That the land itself carries voices, that memory can be returned not in flesh, but in vibration, in reflection, in repeated sound. Even now, to shout into a canyon is to summon that same ancient alliance. The cliffs give back what is offered, a reminder that the earth remembers in reverberation. Perhaps, to our ancestors, each echo was not merely sound returning. It was proof that nothing ever disappears fully, that even in silence there is memory waiting to be awakened. And if cliffs could answer so easily, if a single voice could become many against the stone, then it compels us to wonder what happened when humans found other voices to join the hunt. Not echoes this time, but those belonging to creatures whose instincts and cunning mirrored their own. It begins with a pause in the cold. A herd moves in the distance, hooves stirring the frost, and hunters wait at the tree line. But when they step forward, they are not alone. Shadows move with them, graceful, lean, muscled with hunger. Wolves, too, are watching. Both species hunger, both species endure. It is in this fragile overlap that something remarkable begins to happen. Two predators, once in competition, find in each other a strange reflection. Endurance mirrored in endurance, patience mirrored in patience. And in that reflection, survival itself begins to change. Perhaps it began not with intention, but with nearness. Wolves trailing human groups, circling their fires, testing the margins of fear. Humans noticing their presence, seeing not only the gleam of teeth but the familiar rhythm of the chase. Both moved in families. Both knew how to track, how to wait, how to read the small signals of landscape and prey. Slowly, hesitantly, patterns formed. Hunters and wolves learned to tolerate each other, then to follow each other, then, at last, to work side by side, bound not by words, but by gestures, instincts, and shared necessity. The science is quiet but telling. Fossils preserve bones of wolves found near human settlements, teeth worn differently from their wild counterparts, evidence of diets that blended with scraps of human kills. Burials in ancient soil reveal wolves laid tenderly beside humans, suggesting bonds deeper than convenience. Isotope traces confirm shared ranges, shared sources of prey. From these layered fragments, we begin to see not accident, but alliance. Wolves adapted to our presence, and we, in turn, adapted to theirs, a coevolution of strategy written in both biology and memory. In the open plains, the partnership was tactical. Wolves were faster, able to harry prey across bursts of ground, to exhaust and disorient. Humans were persistent, steady, able to carry the chase beyond the breath of sprinting. Together, their roles aligned into geometry of inevitability. Wolves driving animals into confusion, hunters stepping in with tools to deliver the final strike. No single one could claim the outcome alone. The kill was a product of cooperation, each species amplifying the other, like two instruments tuned to the same patient rhythm. But perhaps something more subtle was unfolding as well. To watch wolves hunt is to glimpse ourselves in another form. The coordinated movement, the silent signals of glances, the clear structure of leadership and cooperation. These are traits we recognize not as foreign, but as familiar. Could it be that in wolves, early humans saw not a rival but a mirror? A reminder that survival is never only individual. It belongs to the group, to the family, to the strength of moving together. And with time, that recognition deepened. The wolves that lingered close became more than allies. They became companions, guardians against the dark, protectors of the camp perimeter where human sight and hearing failed. In return, humans offered warmth, offered scraps, offered the slow weaving of safety into loyalty. Around shared fires, a new bond formed, not predator and predator, but kinship across species. Bones softened into paws that lay closer at night. Eyes once feared became trusted, their watchfulness blending with our own. Perhaps this was one of the first acts of imagination, to consider another species not as threat, not as quarry, but as partner. In doing so, humans shifted the threshold of survival. They stepped into a wider circle, one that extended beyond the human body and allowed other bodies to stand within it. The partnership of wolves may have been the foundation of something larger than hunting. It may have been the foundation of empathy itself, the recognition that life is held strongest when shared, even across the boundaries of fear. Science calls this domestication, but the word feels too mechanical for what it represents. It was less about taming, more about listening, adapting, becoming. Wolves were not broken into submission. They were transformed alongside us, just as we were transformed beside them. Over thousands of years, their bodies changed shape, their temperaments shifted, coats grew varied, eyes softened. What began as alliance grew into legacy, the dogs that now live with us carrying the deep echo of this ancient union. In them, we still carry the memory of wolves at our side, running across plains, breathing against the silence of snow. Could it be that this was the most profound hunt of all? Not the hunt of prey, but the hunt for companionship, for recognition, for something beyond ourselves? To chase with wolves was to admit that survival alone was never enough. It needed to be shared, reflected, echoed back in another's eyes. In wolves, we discovered not just allies, but fragments of identity. Predators that showed us what it meant to be both fierce and communal, independent and yet deeply bound to the group. And though time has turned, though fires have shifted into cities and the wilderness into distant memory, that bond remains. It whispers even now in the quiet presence of a dog by the door, in the trust exchanged wordlessly across species, in the way our eyes still recognize one another without speaking. The hunt that began tens of millennia ago has never really ended. It transformed into something else, an enduring companionship that rewrote what it meant to live, what it meant to care, what it meant to survive together. And yet, if the partnership of wolves could reshape survival itself, what transformations waited along rivers and shorelines, where hunters learned that the ocean's tides and currents demanded strategies different from land, that to live meant learning not only the logic of earth and stone, but also the restless mathematics of water. Not every chase unfolded across plains or ice. Some took place along shifting shorelines, where the boundary between land and water was neither clear nor fixed. Here, hunters stepped into a world ruled not by footsteps or tracks, but by tides, the slow breathing of the ocean itself. Rivers swelled and receded, estuaries widened and narrowed, coasts transformed with every pull of the moon. To hunt by water was to step into another rhythm, one that joined astronomy and geology in a cycle as dependable as it was mysterious. Imagine standing on a shoreline at dusk. The tide begins to draw back, pulling water away and leaving shallow pools behind. Fish become stranded in pockets, their silver bodies glinting in trapped reflections of the fading sky. Seals move with the tide too, resting on rocks when water recedes, slipping gracefully back when it returns. Every creature tied itself to this pattern, every decision written by lunar pull. Hunters learned that the path to survival was not only written in the hunt, but in knowing when the tides would shift. Here, astronomy became as vital as patience. The moon, with its slow cycles, became a hidden communicator of abundance and absence. Rivers wove another kind of opportunity. Salmon moving upstream became living clocks, their migrations predictable yet fleeting. The hunters who waited with spears or nets did not have to chase. only to stand still in the right place, listening to the water's rhythm. The river itself delivered food, guided by geological histories, the carved valleys, the stony beds polished by centuries of current. In this watery world, survival did not mean endless motion. It meant placing oneself where time and geology met, where the flow could be trusted to bring life within reach. The strategies shaped here were different. Nets woven from reeds stretched across narrow pools, their geometry not unlike a spider's web catching creatures suspended between choices. Spears grew barbed, designed to hold in slippery flesh. Stones were rearranged into tidal traps, low-walled enclosures where fish swam in with the rising water, only to find themselves stranded as it fell. These structures, scattered across ancient coastlines and visible even today, are some of the earliest monuments of human ingenuity, built not grandly like temples, but quietly like equations balanced against gravity, water, and lunar pull. Science tells us that hunting by the sea was not a minor addition to survival. It was crucial. The isotopes preserved in bones of early humans revealed diets laced with marine proteins, showing that rivers and oceans may have supported communities far more than sometimes imagined. Shell middens, piles of discarded shells found in layered deposits along coasts, are archives of continuity, proof of repetitive harvest across centuries. Each layer tells of people who returned season after season, trusting the ocean's cycles as if they were kin. And in this turning, perhaps early humans began to feel another truth, that survival was not only struggle but alignment. To live by the water was to live with surrender, not domination but timing. A storm could erase the hunt. A miscalculation of tides could sweep life away as quickly as it delivered abundance. Hunting at the ocean's edge was not about conquering, but about learning when to wait and when to move, when to listen and when to act. The sea rewarded attentiveness far more than arrogance. Is it possible, then, that the ocean became not just environment but teacher? It taught that forces far larger than ourselves, moon, tide, current, storm, shape every choice. It reminded hunters that no strategy exists in isolation, that to pursue fish or seals was to negotiate with the mathematics of the cosmos itself. In this sense, every catch along riverbanks or estuaries was not merely food. It was a conversation with the deep, a moment of acknowledgement that the world is never still, that survival depends on hearing the hidden clockwork of the earth and sky. The ocean hunt also carried memory. Just as footprints in sand told of land journeys, the sediment of shores carried faint records of human presence. Scattered shells, charred fish bones, patterns and stone traps uncovered long after sight and season passed. These, too, are whispers of patience, of strategy stretched across centuries. The ocean did not erase, at least not always. Sometimes it recorded, folding human ingenuity into mudflats and tidopools alongside barnacles and coral. Even now, when we stand by the sea and feel cycles larger than our own lives, something of that memory stirs. We stare into waves and sense their endless rhythm, the balance of pull and release. We watch moonrise and feel the certainty of tides to come. The same patience that belonged to ancient hunters belongs to us too. To wait, to notice, to adapt. These are lessons carried forward through time, survived by water, preserved in salt, etched into tide. And if the ocean could shape patience with rhythm, if water could itself become trap and guide, then what else might hunters have learned about transformation, about blending themselves into the landscape until even identity dissolved, until body and earth became almost indistinguishable? To hunt sometimes meant to vanish. There were moments when survival required not the speed of the chase or the cleverness of a trap, but the subtle erasure of the self. Early humans learned to dissolve into their surroundings, painting bodies with mud, covering skin with ash, stretching hides across shoulders until figure melted into landscape. In these quiet moments, the hunter became tree, rock, or shadow, not merely standing within the world, but almost becoming it. To be seen less was to live more. Imagine the scene. A group waits at the edge of tall grass. Bodies crouched low, their skin darkened by soil rubbed into every crease, every line. From a distance nothing is visible, only the sway of the grass as wind passes over. To the prey, the hunters are no longer human, they are absence, they are background. A flicker of movement might go unnoticed, because it does not belong to the figure of predator, but to the ordinary swaying of leaves. In that stillness, identity softens. The hunter is no longer singular. The hunter is landscape itself. Camouflage was invention, but also listening. Ash was not only soot, it was the residue of fire, of geology shifted into powder, of wood transformed into carbon. Mud was not only clay, it was the blended memory of rivers carrying sediment from hills that had eroded over centuries. To smear these across the body was to clothe oneself in planetary memory, to wear geology as disguise. The land itself became garment, and through it the hunter disappeared. There is science beneath the poetry. Many animals recognize patterns more than details. Their eyes are tuned to movement and shape rather than stillness. A human outline, too smooth and vertical, might startle an antelope or deer. But break that outline with paint, with hides, with branches, and the figure dissolves. Survival was about altering perception, exploiting the way vision works. Early humans, without knowing the language of optics, discovered it by instinct, discovered that to blend was to manipulate the very physics of sight. Could it be that camouflage was as much a philosophical moment as a practical one? What does it mean to cover one's body in earth? To surrender individuality until the line between self and soil blurs. Perhaps in those hours of silence, lying still beneath grass or shadow, early hunters felt themselves part of a larger identity. Not only human, but earth itself, embodied and breathing. Maybe in order to hunt, they had to let go of being entirely visible, entirely separate. They had to become indistinguishable from what surrounded them, teaching the body what language already suggests. That all boundaries are porous, and all selves are temporary. Archaeological hints remain scattered. Painted hides, traces of ochre stained on bone tools, faint patterns suggesting ritual overlapping with camouflage. It is difficult to know when concealment was for hunting, and when it was for ceremony, or if such divisions even mattered. Perhaps for our ancestors the difference was slight. To paint oneself for the chase and to paint oneself for meaning may have been variations of the same practice, the same gesture of dissolving identity into something larger than flesh alone. Even now, the lesson endures. Soldiers, hunters, and naturalists still use camouflage, but beneath technique is something more ancient. To blend is to acknowledge one's incompleteness. It is to admit that the land has always been greater than the body, that in order to survive, we must sometimes let the self be swallowed by shadow. The lesson is one of humility, not to dominate space, but to vanish within it, to let silence and patience become the loudest tools we carry. And so the question lingers. What does it mean to survive by disappearing? What does it mean to let one identity soften in order for life itself to continue? The early hunter hiding among the stones already asked this without words, already lived it in silence. And if the body could vanish so completely, what else could be woven? What patterns of net or web, what designs of fiber and geometry could coax survival in still other ways? To weave a net was to weave time itself. Unlike spear or stone blade, the net required no sudden thrust, no violent moment of strike. It was a patient creation, slow in both making and in use. From reeds gathered along riverbanks, from fibers softened between palms, from strands bitten and twisted into cord, early humans built lattices that resembled something already present in nature. The spider's web, the fisherman's dream, the geometry of pattern itself. Each knot was not only function but memory, a repetition learned and repeated until fingers remembered it long after voices forgot. Picture a hunter crouched on the shore, unrolling a net into the water's edge. Sun slides across rushing currents, each thread darkening in the shallows, becoming nearly invisible to the fish that swim forward unknowingly. The net does not move swiftly, its strength lies in stillness. It waits, stretched across space like a quiet equation. The fish push into it, tangling their bodies not because of force but because of pattern. The hunter lifts, patient, deliberate. What is caught is not taken by violence, but by design carried through water. The geometry of nets is deceptively simple. Loops connect to loops, angles repeat into rhythm, and tension distributes evenly across structure. In this way, fiber carries memory of every knot tied before it. A net holds not only food, but the work of hands, the persistence of practice. To repair it meant to relearn where rhythm failed, where balance broke. In this sense, nets were living algorithms, dynamic systems built by imitation of rivers and vines, enlarged echoes of the natural patterns already surrounding the people who made them. Science tells us that this was a turning point, both practical and cognitive. To weave is to think in abstraction. It is to imagine not only the thread in hand, but the structure still incomplete, the shape that will exist only when dozens of repetitions are finished. The human brain, bending toward foresight and recognition of pattern, grew in part through this kind of patience. The net was proof that survival could be achieved through design, through mathematics etched by hand without need for numbers. Each hunter who folded reeds into shape was also teaching their own mind the quiet rhythm of planning ahead, of shaping a future not yet visible. And still, there is another layer, nets as memory. Their strands could be passed down across generations, repaired and reknotted. The technique itself was inheritance, one human watching another's hands, learning not through explanation but through rhythm observed in motion. To weave was to remember, and memory here became a physical object, something you could hold, stretch, mend. Nets were not only tools of survival but vessels of culture, strands linking past to present, fingers to fingers, body to body. Perhaps this is why the net feels symbolic even now. To catch in silence, to entangle not by force but by connection, it mirrors something larger than hunting. It teaches that life itself is bound together in invisible lattices of relation. Not because we choose them, but because the world is already woven. Rivers shape valleys, roots anchor forests, stars map skies in patterns we cannot control. Humans, too, made patterns, only theirs were threads drawn into loops, small resistances against hunger and uncertainty. Is it possible, then, that nets were humanity's first step toward seeing existence as interconnected? If a fish could be caught not by single hand but by collective strands, then how else might the world also be understood as woven? Each knot holding tension for the next, each gap inviting movement yet shaping boundary. Perhaps the net was more than practical. It was philosophy laid into cordage, a quiet model of how time and matter entangle. Even now, fragments of ancient nets survive, their fibers preserved in bogs, their imprints pressed faintly into clay. They remind us that survival was not always about the conquest of strength. Sometimes it was about patience, about stillness stretched across space, waiting for the inevitable encounter. What was caught in those nets was more than prey. It was proof that knowledge and memory could be material, that thought could survive as form. And yet, if patience could be made visible in the loops of fibers, if survival could be bound with rhythm and repetition, then what might it mean to extend the body further still? Beyond nets, beyond reach, into tools designed to throw farther than the arm alone, reshaping distance itself? A simple length of wood, shaped with purpose, could transform the human body. The spear thrower, what we now call the atlatl, was never loud, never complicated to the eye. Yet in its quiet curve lay a profound shift, a new geometry of power. To place a spear against it was to extend the arm beyond its own limits, to blur where the body ended and where design began. What once depended solely on strength now depended on leverage, on motion harnessed through distance, on physics already embedded in the shape of the tool. With each cast, the atlatl whispered that survival was no longer only flesh, it was engineering carried gently in the hand. Imagine a hunter standing at the edge of a plain. The prey is far, grazing beyond the range of stone thrown by arm alone. But the atlatl bends possibility. A flick of motion, amplified by the tool's length, sends the spear arcing with precision and speed that bare muscle could never achieve. It is not brute force that succeeds here, but mathematics felt rather than spoken. Leverage multiplying energy, the longer lever carrying motion into the shaft carrying intent into the air. The spear becomes not simply released, but launched, time and space rewritten by would shape to curve in the right place. In this invention lies a threshold. The atlatl demanded foresight, demanded a sense of physics long before the word existed. To carve one correctly, to balance weight against arm length, to discover the right arc, was to experiment with invisible laws. Hunters may not have known these principles as formula, but they felt them in the strain of wood, in the success or failure of throws. Every strike of prey confirmed design, every miss compelled adjustment. The atlatl was an education in experimentation, trial written into survival. Each failure made a new equation, tested in silence, solved through instinct. Archaeologists find traces of these tools scattered across continents. Carved bone handles decorated with animals. Smoothed wooden fragments from sites long left behind. Some are etched with designs that seem decorative, but perhaps were also ritual, blending the precision of physics with the softness of memory. To hold such an artifact now is to hold not only a weapon but an idea. That reach can be extended, that the human body can borrow leverage and become something new. This is where technology begins. Not in factories, but in hands that shaped wood into mathematics. The beauty of the atlatl lies in its quiet equation. Force multiplied by distance becomes velocity. Velocity stretched over time becomes reach. The tool did not invent physics, but it allowed humans to participate in it more fully. It turned the body into calculation, bone and sinew combining with design to project survival across wider space. With each throw, invisible numbers danced in the air, trajectory shaped by weight, acceleration turned by arc, gravity folding the flight into eventual descent. Hunting became less about being near and more about bridging distance, less about reaction and more about prediction. And perhaps more than distance, the atlatl carried foresight as philosophy. To use it was to imagine outcomes before they occurred, to picture where the prey would move, to measure the opening window in mind before the spear left the hand. The atlatl was a tool of imagining forward, of extending awareness into seconds not yet lived. Could it be that technology always begins with such small leaps? Not just tools in hand, but visions carried ahead? The spear left the hunter, but hope traveled alongside it, a fragment of intent woven into its arc. There is humility in thinking this way. Every launch was cast into uncertainty, into forces larger than intention. The wind shifted, the prey startled, the hand trembled. Yet still, hunters kept returning to it, refining, trusting the quiet law of leverage. Over time, this patient trust shaped not only their survival, but their understanding of the world. To build an atlatl was to acknowledge that hidden laws exist, that the universe carries within it principles waiting to be discovered by touch, by experiment, by persistence. Even now, we can stand in a museum and see one behind glass, its wood long hushed, its carved handle no longer gripping sinew. And if we listen closely, it still whispers physics, still holds the memory of leverage, still speaks of the time when mathematics was born wordlessly in the interaction of hand and horizon. It tells us that survival was never only about endurance. It was about the courage to shape the world into patterns of possibility. And so, if a mere length of wood could multiply the reach of the human arm, turning thought into projection and survival into geometry, then we must wonder, what transformations waited in darkness itself when hunters extended not their arms, but their courage, stepping out beneath the unfamiliar glow of night and learning to work with shadow, flame, and silence to chase what the day concealed. Night altered everything. When the sun dropped below the horizon and left only shadow, the hunt entered another realm, one shaped less by speed or force and more by patience, silence, and the ability to withstand uncertainty. Darkness was both adversary and ally. It veiled movement, concealed hunters as shapes among deeper shapes, but it also hid dangers, muffled clarity, and blurred the edge between what was real and what was imagined. To hunt in such hours was to negotiate not only with prey but with fear itself, with the vast space of what the eye could not see. The torch became a fragile certainty. Its glow flickered, carving out a trembling circle of light from the overwhelming dark. Within that circle, a hunter's hand and face shimmered in brief clarity, but beyond it stretched the unknown. Shadows seemed alive, shifting as flame bent and snapped. The eyes of animals glowed in the distance, quick flashes of reflection vanishing just as quickly into silence. In those sparks along the horizon, hunters found direction, but also the reminder that others, predators as well as prey, were watching. Nocturnal hunting relied on senses rearranged. Vision gave way to hearing. The rustle of a body pressing through grass, the faint snap of a branch breaking under hoof. Smell sharpened, carrying traces of musk or earth disturbed only moments earlier. Breath itself had to be controlled, softer, quieter, so as not to give away presence. In this quiet, humans became listeners, students of frequencies and whispers. The night demanded humility because it stripped away the illusion of dominance. In darkness, nothing was certain, nothing entirely under control. Science hints at why such hunts were possible. The human eye, under low light, engages rods more than cones, trading color for faint sensitivity to motion. To see in grayscale, to notice the difference between shadow and deeper shadow, was already a kind of strategy. Firelight widened this perception sporadically, but sometimes hunters extinguished torches entirely, trusting the slower adjustment of their eyes to reveal flickers of movement under starlight. Here survival became physiology tuned to astronomy. Retinas guided by the faintest lunar glow, steps measured by rhythms of the sky. But darkness was also threshold. Animals most active at night, deer, boar, smaller mammals, were governed by their own fears, their own long adaptation to navigating under stars. To meet them then was to step into their world, to borrow their arena for the sake of survival. The chase softened into stillness, into ambush rather than pursuit. It was patience, not strength, that opened the possibility of success. Sometimes the wait was long, hours pressed against the earth, listening, breathing, dissolving into the shadows until distinctions between hunter and night began to blur. And perhaps this blurring brought other lessons, more than practical. To wait in darkness is to feel time differently. Moments stretch, distances feel uncertain. The mind begins to imagine, as though the night invites speculative vision as much as physical. Could it be that this was when humans first sensed the mystery of existence most strongly? When silence and shadow combined to suggest presences unseen? A rustle in the brush may have been an animal, or a trick of imagination, or something else entirely. Nights of hunting may have seeded the earliest forms of wonder, of belief, of stories told by fire once the pursuit was done. Archaeological traces whisper of this too. Torches hardened into charcoal fragments, ash paths stretching along old trails, blackened cave mouths where hunts began under starlight. These remnants remind us that the night hunt was not rare, but essential, a way of living that carried both risk and revelation. Every success carved into bone carried proof of patience. Every failure returned to camp became part of memory, passed down as teaching. Even now, when we step outside under quiet skies and hear movement we cannot name, that same ancient negotiation stirs within us. The knowledge that darkness hides, that patience listens, that survival is sometimes about learning not to overcome night, but to live with it. The hunters who entered the black corridors of the past remind us that existence itself is often this balance, between what can be known and what must only be trusted. And if darkness could reveal so much in what it concealed, shaping hunters into listeners and shadows into strategy, then what deeper revelations waited in the places where night never ended? In the cold silence of ice caves, where echoes trapped both sound and prey, and survival unfolded beneath ceilings of stone? Caves are thresholds. To step inside one is to cross from light to dark, from the openness of the world to a chamber carved by stone and silence. In the time of ice, these spaces were more than shelter. They were part of strategy, part of survival, part of the dance between human patience and the enormity of the creatures they hunted. Within walls that had already stood for millions of years, hunters discovered that geology itself could become ally, guiding, containing, amplifying. The earth was not passive. The very shape of its hollows became participant in the unfolding of survival. Imagine the slow approach of mammoth or bison, drawn by instinct toward safer passes, toward shelter from wind and snow. Hunters, who had spent seasons learning the trails, understood these habits. Caves at the edges of valleys became not only refuge but snare. Smoke was coaxed into the chamber, not thick enough to suffocate, but just enough to confuse, to push animals deeper inside or drive them back toward narrow entrances where waiting hunters stood poised. The walls themselves became corridors, turning the distance of open plains into close and echoing passageways. Stone preserved and magnified the presence of the hunt. Every footfall of prey resounded back against walls, amplifying urgency in a way both human and animal could feel. Echoes expanded numbers. Several hunters might sound like many more. For the animals, already disoriented by enclosure, the cave shifted into dissonance, a place where every movement reverberated into confusion. In that confusion, the advantage changed hands. Hunters no longer needed to match size with size, strength with strength. They let stone scatter sound into weapon. Geology shaped this strategy in deeper ways. Many Ice Age caves formed from limestone, carved by ancient water into hollows that breathed drafts of air. Some rooms opened into chambers tall as cathedrals. Others narrowed into passages so tight the body could just squeeze through. Hunters learned to map these cavities not as geological wonders, but as patterns of movement. Where a mammoth would hesitate, where its great body would not fit, where echoes would confuse, where smoke would gather, they studied each possibility until the cave itself became blueprint for survival. Archaeologists find subtle traces of these encounters. Bones of extinct megafauna appear near cave mouths, clustered and broken. Charcoal lies blackened in layers. Remnants of fires burned for both warmth and strategy. Sometimes art marks the walls, images of mammoth, bison, reindeer. Reminders that these places were not just used, but remembered, their stone canvases recording both reverence and practicality. To paint in such places may have been more than decoration. It may have been recognition that the cave was not merely background, but living partner, one that could hold memory long after the bodies were gone. Science adds another dimension. Stable isotopes within cave deposits, stalagmites laden with millennia of mineral growth, reveal cycles of ice and thaw, of drought and water. Hunters who used these caves were unknowingly responding to those same cycles. When glaciers advanced, prey moved differently, and caves once unused became pathways. The geometry of survival was written in climate as much as in tactics. Just as we read isotopes in mineral water today, hunters once read drafts of cold air, hands pressed to stone, senses tuned to the rhythm of rock. There is something almost spiritual in imagining these hunts. To corner a beast in darkness was not only an act of need, but of courage. The cave enveloped hunter and hunted alike, erasing the outside world, folding both into silence and shadow. In that chamber, all strength and size seemed balanced, all boundaries blurred. The walls, dripping with water, glittering with frost, watched without judgment. Light from torches glowed against stone older than memory, smoke curling into airspaces shaped when oceans still covered the earth. To chase prey into these depths was to hunt not only an animal, but survival itself within the container of geological time. Could it be that this closeness, this merging of human need with stone's embrace, left something inside us? Even today, when we step into caves, we feel awe, unease, reverence. Perhaps it is because our ancestors did not merely shelter there. They tested fate within such hollows. They used echoes as voice, smoke as guide, stone as trap. The memory has not vanished. It lingers in the silence, in the way our eyes search the dark as if expecting movement, in the way our ears catch every echo as though it might carry news of survival. In the end, the ice caves remind us that hunting was not always about dominating the world around us. Sometimes it was about listening carefully enough to borrow the intelligence of stone, to let geology shape the story. Each captured beast was not only prey, but part of a larger equation. The weight of climate, the persistence of time, the strategies carved into the Earth's own body. And if caves could be used as living traps, if stone itself could be coaxed into guiding the hunt, what transformations arrived when humans discovered a quieter weapon still? That survival could depend not on enclosing animals in stone, but on sending silence itself into the air, stretched across a bow's string like breath released from the body of wood. Survival changed when the bow was born. Where once the hunt thundered with footsteps, struggled with brute pursuit, or echoed inside cliffs. Now it grew quiet. The bow was a simple curve of wood bent against itself, a sinew string drawn taut, but in its silence lay transformation. The arrow it carried did not announce itself with noise or fire. It whispered. It slipped through the air almost invisibly, a breath disguised as flight. For the first time, survival relied not on endurance or overwhelming force, but on precision, on the fragile tension between stillness and release. Imagine the moment a hunter drawing the string back. The body holds both power and restraint, muscles trembling not with movement but with waiting. Breath slows. Time compresses into the soft hum of tension. Then the string lets go, and in that instant possibility unfolds. The arrow becomes a line bridging the hunter's body to the world beyond. As it cuts through space, it says nothing. It does not roar like fire. It does not stampede like hoof. It whispers into the air, carrying quiet intent toward an uncertain future. The physics of this invention is delicate. Energy stored within wood and sinew transfers in a heartbeat into the shaft. Velocity bursts forward, reaching distances far beyond unaided arms. The bow transformed what persistence shaped into something subtler, more controlled. A spear demanded endurance, a chase measured in hours, but an arrow measured survival in seconds. Here geometry ruled, the curve of the bow deciding strength, the angle of release deciding trajectory, the weight of the shaft harmonizing with distance. Without knowing words like momentum or elasticity, hunters had found them embodied in wood and fiber. Archaeological remains remind us of this quiet revolution. Fragments of bows preserved in peat, arrowheads buried beside bones, shafts carbon-stained inside caves. All evidence of precision layered upon generations. Tools grew lighter, more portable, more complex. Hunters who had once run for hours across plains could now remain still, hidden within grass or tree line, and send prey into silence without being close. In this silence lay a deep change in consciousness. Hunting no longer meant entering into struggle. It increasingly meant disappearing, watching, waiting for the right moment to let breath and would carry life forward. But perhaps the bow carried stories older than its tools. The string, curved and drawn, carried echoes of music yet to come. To release, it was to pluck vibration into the world. Could it be that the first bow was also, unknowingly, the first instrument? The whisper of arrows may have seeded the whisper of song, reminding humans that sound and silence exist always in balance. The bow's curve was functional, yet also lyrical, like a gesture toward harmony with forces larger than our own. There is something philosophical here too. To draw a bow is to hold tension, potential energy at its peak. To release it is to surrender control, to accept that once the arrow leaves, outcome belongs to the laws of wind and gravity. Each shot was faith disguised as strategy. Precision was never absolute, but always carried by unseen currents. Hunters may have learned humility in this way, that survival was never entirely in their hands, but shared with the unseen balance of forces. Even now, when we hold an arrow, we sense its quiet lineage. The feathered fletching, the sharpened point, the gentle curve of the shaft, they are more than objects. They are memory of silence and breath, reminders of a time when survival meant mastering not the chase, but restraint. Not running until exhaustion, but standing still until the right moment trembled beneath the finger and then slipped away. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of the bow, that sometimes strength is not measured in how long you endure, but in how softly you let go. The release of an arrow was a whisper carried through air, an invisible promise binding hunter and world together in fragile mathematics of direction and timing. A whisper that could nourish, sustain, or fail, yet always teach. And if silence itself could be sharpened and launched, if survival could rest within a single breath carried into distance, then what else might hunters have learned about time? Could survival also be read not in single arrows, but in the endless patterns of seasons, in the return of herds across years, in the memory of landscapes that gave and withdrew in rhythm? Time has always moved in rhythms, but in the deep past it was not tracked by calendars or carved lines on stone. It was read instead from the land itself, from the migrations of herds, from the turning of tundra grass from green to pale, from the quiet return of footprints pressed into the same paths across seasons. For hunters, survival was not only the act of pursuing the present moment. It was the art of remembering what had come before, anticipating what would come again. In this way, hunting became less a chase of bodies, more a herding of time itself. Imagine the great herds moving across wide plains, hooves drumming in thousands, rivers of muscle stretching from horizon to horizon. They moved not aimlessly, but with hidden purpose, guided by the geography of abundance. Where water pooled, where fresh grazing followed the melt of ice, where valleys opened into safety during storms. To follow these herds was to step into their clock, a clock wound by sun, moon, and season. The hunters did not invent this rhythm. They joined it, letting the migration decide the course of their own lives. Each year carried promise, that as the winds shifted and grasses returned, so too would food. Science confirms this legacy. Isotope readings from bones of prehistoric animals tell us of seasonal stress when food ran scarce, of migrations where rivers flowed fuller, of the repetition of survival across centuries. Herds carried the cycle in their bodies, just as hunters carried it in memory. Each turning of season made familiarity sacred. The same trail, the same valley, the same crossing. The world itself became recurring story, written not on page but in paths pressed into soil and snow. For the hunter, to remember was as important as to pursue. The old trails taught that what vanishes can return, that the absence of prey in one season may transform into abundance in the next. A landscape empty in winter swelled with life after thaw. A river barren in drought teemed with fish after floods. To live by following was to place survival into rhythm larger than any individual. It was to admit that endurance was not only body, but memory sustained across generations. Perhaps this is where a deeper sense of time first arose, the recognition that the future mirrored the past, that absence could fold back into presence. Could it be that by following these cycles, hunters began to see time not as an endless line, but as a circle? Not all returns were the same, yet there was always pattern, repetition with variation, endless spirals of movement. Survival, then, was less about conquering uncertainty and more about listening for its curves. And in those cycles lived philosophy. What does it mean to know that what is gone will come again, though differently? To walk the same trails your elders walked, to wait at the same crossing where footprints years older than your own still linger faintly in soil? Perhaps memory itself is nothing more than migration inside us. Thoughts circling back, patterns repeating, footsteps returned over and over through the mind. The evidence lies beneath us still. Ancient kill sites show repeated use. Layers of bones stacked not in single moments, but in waves across centuries. Archaeologists uncover mammoth, bison, reindeer, each horizon of remains echoing the last. Survival was not a singular hunt but a ritual recurrence, as if the earth itself was staging the same story again, inviting new participants in each generation. To think of this is to feel both small and enduring. The hunters stepped into patterns not of their making, patterns governed by entropy and climate, by tilts of orbit and breaths of atmosphere. They relied upon ice to melt, upon grass to regrow, upon rivers to swell. And in doing so, they aligned with a truth, that life is always held inside cycles greater than any single existence. That to feed was not to take from chaos, but to participate in rhythm. Even now, we feel the remnants of this cyclical knowledge. We wait for migrations of birds overhead, for the return of seasons, for the quiet predictability of days lengthening and fading. We may no longer depend directly on herds for survival, but we still measure ourselves by recurrence, by the soft return of what was lost and the patient trust that tomorrow may resemble yesterday. And so herding time itself was never just about animals. It was a living philosophy carried in movement, the recognition that to remain alive, one had to join the circle, let memory guide action, and trust what the world promised in its repetitions. And yet, if survival could be written across years as gently as herds returning to the same earth, then what other lessons were held in the remains they left behind? In the bones worked into tools, the antlers carved into function, the silent teachers shaped not from presence, but from what once lived and had already passed. Bone remembers. Long after sinew decays, long after flesh dissolves into soil, the scaffolding remains. It lingers in pale silence, a record of form, a reminder of presence. In the deep past, hunters did not let these remnants go unnoticed. Antler, ivory, and bone became more than byproducts of death. They became teachers, transformed into tools that carried both survival and memory. Each cut, each polished edge, each carved hole in ivory was not only a design for living, but a quiet dialogue with what was lost. To hold a tool of bone was to hold absence, sharpened into usefulness, turned forward into future. Imagine the hunter shaping an antler tine beneath the glow of firelight. It is carved into a point, perhaps to pierce again in some other prey. The hand that chips it understands what remains invisible. That antler carried a life once, a breath steaming in winter air, a body that moved across tundra grass, now gone. The tool remembers what the hunter will not see again. It is a reliquary etched in silence, made functional as if time itself could be repurposed. The past was not left behind. It was carried into the present, splinter by splinter, into objects touched daily. Archaeologists uncover these pieces scattered like whispers. Needles carved from reindeer bones, their eyes drilled through, allowing thread to pass. Harpoons made from ivory, still bearing the delicate grooves of human hands. Decorative fragments etched with patterns that seem like symbols, though their meanings sleep beyond our reach. Each object is more than artifact. It is a transcript of ingenuity laid upon mortality. Bone becomes archive, preserving not just a hunt's success, but an inheritance of patience, skill, awareness. Science adds deeper resonance. Bone holds isotopes within it, faint chemical markers of life lived. The grass a mammoth consumed, the water a reindeer drank, the climate of the year it moved through. When humans carved into these bones, they carved into memory locked at the molecular scale. Unintentionally, they carried time forward literally and figuratively. The ivory needle was both instrument for stitching hides and a timepiece of vanished seasons, of grazing paths long since gone. Death became instrument of life. Memory became material that shaped tomorrow. Perhaps this was also philosophy. The hunter shaping a bone harpoon was not only solving hunger's urgency. They were engaging with the reality that all life returns, all bodies revert to material. To transform remains into tools was to acknowledge mortality transparently, to say, this creature is gone, but it teaches still. Every tool was lesson. Every scar held echo, not because humans saw death as romantic, but because death was presence, unavoidable and daily. To live well meant to repurpose it, to carry its wisdom into continued survival. Could it be that this intimacy with bone deepened humanity's sense of memory? To clothe oneself with furs is to use the external gift of another life. But to carve bone, to work its channels into needles, fishhooks, points, was to enter its structure, to alter its shape, to converse quietly with what came before. Each tool was dual. Functional, yes, but also symbolic, a reminder that living is never separate from dying. The body of prey sustained twice, once as flesh-feeding hunger, once as skeleton reshaped into persistence. Even now, when we see such tools in museums, we admire their practicality, but we also feel their quiet weight. There is humility in them. The smooth polish of ivory aged by countless touches, the fine groove of bone shaped to sit in a hand, the faint cracks that remain like scars. All of these carry echoes of vanished herds. They are not merely tools. They are the last voices of animals turned into instruments for human survival. In their silence lies more teaching than words could ever hold. And perhaps this is what makes them so enduring. Stone, wood, and fiber erode, but bone holds shape longer, as if reluctant to give itself back to soil. In its durability lies its memory, and in its memory lies its teaching. That nothing ends fully, that what falls can feed, can shape, can guide still. And if bone tools taught humans to find lesson in mortality, to shape survival from what is lost, then what new form of wisdom emerged in tools that required even less movement? When hunters discovered that silence itself, and stillness hidden in the reeds, could become the sharpest instruments of all. Stillness has always been a kind of weapon. When the chase would give away too much, when strength could not overcome, when the distance between life and hunger narrowed to thin margins, hunters turned to silence. They learned to wait longer than their prey could suspect, to fold themselves into shadows, to nestle into reeds, to lean against stone until they no longer belonged to themselves but to the landscape. An ambush was not only an act of hunting, it was an act of becoming, of surrendering the self into the patience of geology itself. Imagine a hunter in the shallows of a riverbank. Water curls over ankles, cold and slow. Tall reeds sway overhead, disguising shape, disguising breath. Hours pass in near immobility. The muscles ache not with action, but with waiting. And then, at last, the herd approaches, hooves pressing into soil softened by the river's edge. To strike too early is failure. To move too late is failure, too. In those moments, survival becomes equality with time itself, the hunter measuring the pulse of stillness until the world finally turns in their favor. There is mathematics beneath this quietness. Stillness confuses perception. Animals depend on noticing motion, not on identifying shapes. To remain frozen is to become invisible, to trick the biology of other creatures into forgetting presence. Branches tied to the back of a crouched hunter, mud smeared across skin, a rock used as shield. Each of these was an equation against vision and expectation. The ambush was patience expressed as probability. Fewer movements meant fewer chances to be seen, which meant greater likelihood of success. Physics, biology, and psychology, all hidden in the decision not to move. Geology itself offered examples. Mountains do not chase. Rivers do not rush except when commanded by rainfall. But over time they shape everything. Hunters mirrored this, learning to erode fear by stillness, to wear down uncertainty as rivers wear down stone. The ambush was this, the quiet acceptance that sometimes the smallest, slowest motion is the one that carries most effect. Not a sprint, not a chase, but the calm, observed gap between moments. Archaeological evidence flickers with this story. Sites show bones clustered where narrow passes and rock overhangs meet, places where geometry and cover offered concealment. Spears discovered in such locations suggest strategy not of pursuit, but of interception, of lying hidden until prey walked unknowingly into reach. If persistence hunting stretched human survival across time, ambush distilled survival into a single moment, the precise edge between waiting and striking, between silence and action. And perhaps, in stillness, hunters discovered something beyond strategy. Waiting in silence dissolves boundaries. The line between body and stone begins to blur, between breath and wind, between heartbeat and soil. In such moments, the hunter no longer feels separate from the world. They are folded into its patience, adopting its rhythms. Could it be, then, that ambush was not only about survival, but about learning how to vanish into place, how to surrender human urgency until it no longer mattered? Even now, long after such strategies faded into memory, we carry a trace of it. We wait without moving when observing birds in forests. We sit without sound when hoping to glimpse deer at the edge of dusk. Something in us remembers that to stop is sometimes more powerful than to move. The patience of geology still runs quietly in our instincts. And so, ambushes remind us of a paradox, that action is not always louder than waiting, that silence itself can hold the weight of survival. And if humans once learned to let the Earth's own patience shape their strategies, then it leads us to wonder about the hunts that were never only about hunger at all, but about meaning, about ritual, about the ceremonies that blurred necessity with reverence under open skies. For most of prehistory, the hunt was never only about food. To chase, to wait, to capture, to kill. These were acts upon which survival depended, yes, but they also carried meanings extending far beyond hunger. The pursuit of an animal was not simply transaction. It was ceremony, a lived philosophy that gave shape to identity and tethered human life to the deep cycles of the earth. To hunt was to step into rhythm, to touch not only body to body, but spirit to world, memory to present, and present to future. Imagine hunters gathering at dawn. The sky bruises with pale color, smoke rising faintly from embers tended through night. Before they leave, words are spoken, not out of superstition alone, but out of recognition. Gratitude whispered to animal spirits, or to the land itself, for what might unfold. Sometimes pigment was painted onto skin, ochre or ash across face and chest, not always to conceal, but to signify, the body becoming part of story. To approach the hunt without such gestures would feel incomplete, as though the sacred thread between prey, hunter, and earth had not yet been woven. The evidence lingers in fragments. Cave paintings that show not only the act of hunting but ceremonies surrounding it. Human figures dancing with animal outlines, handprints layered across walls as if leaving marks of witness, not dominance. Carved bones etched with patterns hint at symbolic meaning, talismans carried with each outing. Burial sites where antlers, tusks, or animal bones lay beside human remains remind us that the hunt was carried into death itself, as if to declare that one could not separate identity from pursuit. These remnants tell us plainly that to hunt was to live, and to live was to join a philosophy written in both flesh and reverence. Science gives us framework to better understand this layering. Archaeologists study butchery marks and isotope traces, but they also note the arrangement of bones and artifacts in ceremonial context, suggesting intentional placement, ritualized remembrance. Some societies created feasts from single kills, breaking meat and marrow into distribution not of necessity, but of unity among group. This was more than caloric sharing, it was binding story. To eat together what had been chased together was an act of continuity, nourishing relationship as much as body. And beyond evidence, there is speculation that feels no less real. Could it be that the act of offering thanks, or of embedding songs, was humanity's way of acknowledging the paradox of survival? That for us to endure, another life must end? Ceremony gave shape to that paradox, transforming necessity into something held with dignity, softening the wound of mortality by folding it into meaning. When blood met soil, ritual met silence, giving a sense that the hunt was not theft, not cruelty, but continuation of a cycle larger than hunter or prey. Perhaps this is where philosophy itself emerged, a recognition that every act of survival carried mystery, that existence thrived only through continual exchange. Through rites and songs, the hunters reminded themselves that they were participants, not rulers, bound by limits of time and bound by mortality. The animal became teacher, its death a lesson that life survives only through transformation. The antler that became a tool, the bones that became a needle, the hide that became warmth, all were extensions of this teaching. Ceremony, then, was not ornament, it was understanding. Even today, when we study indigenous hunting practices that persisted into modern times, we find echoes of this thread. The offer of tobacco to the spirit of an animal, words spoken into wind or water as body is dressed, dances that reenact the chase not for spectacle but for remembrance. These are not isolated cultural flourishes, but universal echoes of a deep truth. The hunt has always been more than hunger. It has been a dialogue, one made visible through ritual. What lingers so hauntingly about this is its resemblance to memory itself. To perform ritual is to repeat, to return, to keep alive what otherwise fades. Just as the seasons circle, just as migrations return, ceremonies preserved meaning across generations. In each act of gratitude, hunters embedded identity. They taught those who came after, survival is not merely about taking, it is about remembering. Each chase became archive, each ritual became philosophy. Could it be that ceremony gave rise to what we now call culture? That when humans gathered to mark hunts with meaning, they were also inventing art, music, and story. Out of necessity grew symbolism, and out of symbolism grew the larger webs of identity. The hunt offered the raw materials, bone, blood, rhythm, and ceremony reshaped them into memory. To paint an animal on a cave wall was not only to describe it, but to ensure its cycle continued in presence, if not in body. The hunt gave food, but the ceremony gave meaning to being itself. And so, the chase becomes something more than predator pursuing prey. It becomes a framework through which humans understood the world. Gratitude for what was taken, reverence for what was lost, recognition of mortality in every success. The ceremonial hunt wrote philosophy without books, told stories without script, sculpted identity without monuments. It whispered, life persists not because of dominance, but because of shared cycles, because of recognition that living is always bound to giving, to taking, to remembering. And if survival itself could be wrapped with symbolism, then what happened in the moments when the Earth refused to cooperate, when climate shifted, when glaciers advanced or receded, when drought rewrote patterns of prey? How did hunters respond when their ceremonies collided with forces larger than memory, with the restless movements of climate itself? The Earth was never still. Glaciers advanced and retreated like tides of stone, carving valleys and leaving scars of silence behind. Winds shifted across continents, sometimes bringing warmth, sometimes drawing drought. Rains wandered, flooding one region while abandoning another. For those who depended on the movement of herds and the promise of water, these cycles were not distant curiosities. They were the very edge of survival itself. Hunting strategies were shaped not only by animals or tools, but by the restless breath of climate, written into layers of ice and soil long before hunters stepped into them. Imagine a group of hunters placing their camp beside a river that had always flowed in spring. Generations remembered its swell, the way animals came to drink as grass returned. But then one season, the waters thinned, the fish diminished, the herds arrived late. The rhythm faltered. What had once been reliable no longer returned as expected. In that moment, survival required not stubbornness but adaptation. Migrating farther, chasing new herds, learning new landscapes, reshaping memory to meet altered cycles. Like rivers carving new paths after flood, hunters bent their strategies toward the changes they could not control. Science allows us to see these shifts etched into the planet's memory. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica reveal tiny bubbles of atmosphere, preserved for tens of thousands of years. Within them are stories of carbon, of ash from ancient eruptions, of sudden cold snaps triggered by volcanic winters. Their layers preserve abrupt droughts and long melts, the very moments when human communities were forced to reimagine survival. Soil horizons, too, carry traces. Baked clays from arid years, lush pollen bursts from times of abundance, charcoal horizons from landscapes scorched by fire. Hunters lived inside these transitions without measurement, but their choices were consequences of the same atmospheric pulses we now study with instruments. In glacial cold, endurance became everything. The frozen chase, the ambush of animals weakened by snow. During retreat, when rivers swelled and grasslands spread wide, strategy shifted again. Migrations grew richer but also longer, demanding foresight to follow. The bow may have emerged more swiftly in lands where prey dispersed unpredictably, where patience and precision surpassed pursuit. Nets and traps became crucial in drought-prone estuaries, where water captured life briefly before vanishing back into absence. Technology always spoke to climate, woven inseparably into each alteration of wind or cloud. Could it be that climate was the first true adversary, larger than predator, larger than prey? Not because it meant harm, but because it allowed no negotiation. The glacier did not bargain. The drought did not relent. The hunters could only adapt, learning to read the faint signals of coming change. Ice thinning, patterns of grass fading, winds shifting their familiar direction. In this way, survival was less contest and more partnership with inevitability. To endure was to bend like trees in storms, not to resist but to follow the currents of larger cycles. This demanded memory across generations. Parents told children not only of hunts, but of places once known for water, valleys once rich with herds. When the world shifted again, those fragments of story became guidance, a way of recalling that nothing is permanent, that the Earth's surface moves in its own rhythm. The very act of remembering became survival strategy, teaching that scarcity was never final, that abundance was always temporary. Patience, foresight, and memory. These were the hidden weapons carved by climate itself into the minds of those who lived within its flux. When we uncover ancient hunting sites now, we see climate's fingerprint clearly. Bones of mammoth layered with sudden absence, hinting at shattered populations. tools abandoned in drying riverbeds, suggesting migrations that moved too quickly to carry everything forward. Even isotopes within human remains tell stories of shifting diets, revealing communities that turned from large game to fish, from fish to gathered plants, from plants back to herds, each alteration dictated by climate's edge. These patterns are not failures. They are experiments in survival, humanity's willingness to change shape against the inescapable current of the Earth's breath. Perhaps in this constant adjustment, humans learned humility that still feels relevant. For if glaciers and droughts shaped our ancestors' lives so irrevocably, then what of us now, living under climates changing once more? The ancient lesson persists, that we are inseparable from atmosphere, from temperature, from rain and wind. We may feel removed from it, but the same fragile thread ties us still. The hunters who adapted like rivers did so not with arrogance, but with acceptance, trusting that to follow the Earth's shifts was wiser than attempting to resist them. And yet, even as climate tested survival, it also generated memory. It preserved itself within ice and soil, just as it preserved itself in rituals and tools. To live on the climatic edge was to accept impermanence as the first law of existence. To learn again and again that nothing remains steady, that the only strategy lasting across millennia is adaptation. And if climate could reshape entire worlds, scattering herds and guiding hunters into new forms of knowledge, then what of imagination itself? What role did it play when survival required not just responding to change, but inventing deceptions, illusions, and decoys that turned possibility into reality? What happened when humans discovered they could remake not only tools, but perception itself? Deception entered the hunt softly, not as trickery alone, but as imagination stretching into survival. Where pursuit required strength and ambush required patience, illusion required vision, the ability to see not only what was, but what could be. Hunters learned to craft figures from wood or bone, decoys placed across waters where birds might circle. They learned to shape their voices into imitations of calls, turning their throats into instruments of mimicry. Echoes bouncing through valleys became allies, imitating numbers greater than their own. In these moments, survival became theater, and imagination stood as sharp as stone. Picture a flock circling above a wetland. Below, wooden carvings float upon the surface, their outlines convincing enough to invite the living closer. The birds lower, believing safety has already gathered. What they see is not reality but suggestion, the first glimmer of an idea turned into tool. In this, hunters displayed a profound instinct, not simply to chase what exists, but to invent what will persuade. The decoy did not kill. It altered perception. The kill came later, carried by the arrow or net, but without illusion, it would not have arrived. There is science beneath this subtlety. Many animals respond instinctively to shapes, calls, movement. By exploiting patterns in vision and sound, humans gained advantage not by power but by understanding. The carved figurine manipulated optics, the mimicry of calls manipulated hearing, the echo manipulated space itself. These were applications of biology long before biology became science. Illusion revealed not the hunter's dominance, but their deep listening to what prey trusted, and their ability to speak in that silent language. Archaeologists uncover these whispers in fragments. Bird-shaped carvings from bone, delicate and precise, found in sediments where ancient lakes once spread. Flutes of animal bone that may have become more than music, mimicking calls across water or forest. Sites where stones line valleys, perhaps arranged not for trap, but for echo, amplifying shouts into resonant forces. Each suggests the same truth. Imagination was never a luxury. It was necessity encoding creativity directly into survival. But perhaps something deeper was unfolding in this use of illusion. In shaping decoys and casting false voices into air, humans learned they could alter reality itself, at least for another set of eyes or ears. Could it be that this awareness fed into story, myth, and ritual? That the same instinct which carved a decoy bird on water might also carve a painted mammoth on stone, shaping what others believed as surely as what animals perceived. The boundary between deception and meaning blurs quickly. The hunt was where imagination first proved itself indispensable, not as play, but as survival. There is tenderness, too, in the thought. To deceive is not always to harm. It is to understand deeply, to see the trust animals place in symbols, in sound, in repetition. Hunters imitated rather than overpowered, persuaded rather than forced. The decoy, in this way, feels almost like empathy turned inside out, the recognition of what another being expects to see or hear, and the subtle playing of that expectation against them. Illusion was survival, yes, but also reflection, the recognition that perception binds all living things, and that reality is never as solid as stone. Even now, illusion remains embedded in us. We still hear echoes that trick our sense of distance. We still build images to persuade, to alter perspective, to shape choices. The first decoy birds floating on water became ancestors of imagination itself, reminding us still that perception can be shaped as surely as tools can be sharpened. And so, the earliest deceptions leave us with questions more haunting than answers. What else did hunters imagine when they carved and mimicked? Did they already sense that the line between real and reflected was tenuous? That survival lay not only in strength, but in the ability to reshape the very experience of another being. And if deception could so easily blur reality in the hunt, then what happened when strategy expanded beyond illusion into cooperation, when survival no longer rested on individual skill, but on the breath and movement of many, aligned together as though they were parts of one shared body, moving as a single tide? The hunt was never truly solitary. Even when one pair of eyes spotted prey, or a single hand loosed the spear, the act itself was woven from countless threads of presence around it. Survival moved most strongly when it moved together, when a group breathed as one body, flowing not in chaos but in rhythm. In this way, hunting became less the story of individuals and more the story of cooperation, the breath of many drawn into single purpose. Imagine the moment before a drive begins. A line of hunters spread across a valley's edge, watching one another, subtle in their gestures. One tilts a chin, another presses palm against low grass, another shifts quietly in shadow. Words would be too loud, too disruptive. Instead, communication is carried in silence, through glances, through the smallest rhythms of motion. The group becomes like a stream dividing into multiple channels, then rejoining, guiding animals toward paths carefully chosen. Their cooperation is choreography written not with plans but with trust. In the deep past, such group hunts were more than convenience. They were necessity. Large prey, mammoth, bison, reindeer, could rarely be taken alone. It required not just skill but sequence. Some positioned to drive, others to wait, some to strike at the final opening. The success of the hunt depended not on the strength of one, but on the patience of all. When the animal faltered, it was because the circle tightened with precision, no single hand closing in too soon, no single step breaking harmony. Like the cooling drift of wind shaping sand, the group together guided outcome. Science lends clarity to this picture. Kill sites unearthed show not single carcasses, but multiple animals taken together, suggesting coordinated drives. Footprints fossilized in soft sediment show adults alongside younger hunters, moving in spread formation. Archaeologists uncover evidence of cliff drives, where entire herds were corralled as groups of people worked in orchestration. One person could build a trap, but only many together could fill a valley with silence that redirected thousands of hooves toward a single decisive edge. And in this togetherness was philosophy, though perhaps unspoken. To hunt together required trust, not blind trust, but shared experience. Everyone knew their place, their timing, their role within the larger pattern. This was not hierarchy in the way later cities would impose it, but cooperation built through familiarity, kinship, and care. The breath of cooperation was rhythm itself, inhaled when prey first appeared, held in suspense as the group moved into position, exhaled together when the strike came. Could it be that this breath, this shared rhythm, was what laid the foundation for community beyond the hunt? Coordinated chases taught humans the power of belonging, of moving beyond the self, of becoming larger than what one body can achieve. Perhaps language itself found part of its origin here, not in solitary thought, but in gestures and sounds shaped by collective necessity. Cooperation in survival may have been the first architecture of society, a weaving of voices and silences into the structure of us. There was meaning beyond the practical, too. To return from such a hunt was to share not only meat but story, not only survival but memory. Around flames, each member of the group carried their fragment of the larger whole, recounting where they stood, what they saw, how the animal moved. Together, these fragments became narrative, and narrative became inheritance, teaching the next hunt before it unfolded. Cooperation thus extended beyond the kill, into the way memory itself was stored, not in one person but in all. Even now we carry this imprint. Modern life may scatter us into solitude, but we still feel instinctive response when moving together. A song sung in chorus, a crowd swaying in rhythm, even the unspoken alignment of footsteps with a friend at our side. These are echoes of the same collective pulse. The breath of cooperation has never left us. It remains the quiet thread pulling identity into belonging, reminding us that our survival was always bound to our ability to move as part of something larger. And so, cooperation transformed the hunt from act into story, from survival into culture. It whispered, "We existed not because of strength, but because of rhythm, the rhythm of shared breath, shared intent, shared patience." We became human not when we hunted alone, but when we hunted as many, bound together by silence and trust. And yet, for all this unity, danger never vanished. The land was also home to predators larger than ourselves, predators who could turn hunter into prey in a moment. To breathe together was power, but sometimes the breath caught in fear, when eyes in the dark reminded us that roles could always reverse. There were moments when the chase reversed, and the hunter's confidence dissolved into something older, deeper, the awareness of vulnerability. Lions stretched low in the grass, saber-toothed cats slipping like shadows between trees, cave bears looming in the half-light of their dens. In these encounters, survival was not assured. Every pursuit carried the possibility of becoming prey. The balance tilted, and reciprocity revealed itself. Life was never one-sided, never a simple narrative of dominance. The earth reminded us that invention could be humbled, and that fear, too, was part of endurance. Imagine the quiet of night, torches flickering low at the camp's edge. Beyond the circle of fire, eyes gleam, watchful, patient, unblinking. The hunters are not moving now. They are listening, waiting, understanding that others stalk them in silence. Every rustle could be wind, or it could be predator. Every shadow could be branch or claw. The familiar instinct to chase turns inward, and the body learns another truth. To survive is also to be seen, to be measured, to be vulnerable. The fossil record holds this memory. Bones marked with claw-etched grooves, human remains buried alongside predator teeth, suggest that death often arrived swiftly, decisively. In caves where humans sought shelter, bears had once lived too. Sometimes the two species collided in raw confrontation, and sometimes humans were driven out entirely. Archaeology reveals not only hunts won, but hunts lost. These scars across bone and earth remind us that survival was always precarious, always shared across a thin boundary between dominance and disappearance. Science explains the disadvantage. Predators like lions and saber-toothed cats had speed and strength honed by millions of years of evolution. Their jaws and claws were purpose-built for sudden violence. Humans had no such natural weapons. Instead, we had stones, fire, patience. But tools could falter. A spear missed its mark. A fire failed in the wind. In those moments, flesh remained flesh, no different from deer or bison. The reciprocity of survival was written into every encounter. When hunters followed trails, they risked becoming trails themselves. Yet perhaps these dangers sharpened something beyond fear. To live where predators hunted too meant living in constant awareness, a vigilance that carved itself into memory. Every glance over the shoulder, every prickle of unease at unseen eyes, it was instinct shaped by millennia under the watch of larger beings. Could it be that these predators were not only adversaries but teachers? They honed perception, speed, cooperation. The very intelligence that lifted humans forward may have grown in the shadow of lions and bears. Awareness, after all, often emerges first from danger. There was humility in this dance. Hunters may have carried spears, but predators carried presence. In seeing themselves mirrored in the great cats, humans discovered a troubling resemblance. They too were predators, shaped by hunger, by cunning, by pursuit. Was survival then simply a cycle, where roles blurred, where hunter and hunted traded places again and again? Could the human story be less about conquest and more about acceptance, that the line between prey and predator is always thin, always shifting? Even today, echoes of this vulnerability remain within us. We rarely face lions or bears in daily life, yet our bodies carry the memory. The sudden rush of adrenaline at an unexpected sound in the dark, the unease of being watched by eyes we cannot see. These instincts are old reminders that once, survival meant knowing we could be taken at any moment, that invention never erased fragility. The reciprocity of survival humbles. It whispers that no invention, no amount of cleverness, can fully erase the fundamental truth. We live inside a web where every predator is also prey, where every life can falter, where risk is never abolished but only postponed. And if risk shaped awareness, if predators carved fear into wisdom, then what mysteries remain in the stories of those hunts that ended not with survival, but with silence, extinctions that closed entire chapters, hunts remembered not for triumph but for absence lingering ever after. There were hunts that never returned. Trails once followed across valleys faded into silence. Footprints pressed into mud and snow ended abruptly in eras that would never repeat. Some prey, vast and timeless in presence, vanished forever. We are left to imagine the final hunts, the last mammoth driven across tundra, the last great bison collapsing beneath spears, the final echo of animals that had once thundered across continents. Extinction leaves more than silence. It leaves a weight, heavy in memory, woven into identity, whispering to us that survival always carries shadow and loss. Picture it. A small band of hunters moves across frozen ground, driven less by hunger than by necessity. In the distance, the movement of immense forms, mammoths against the horizon, their silhouettes blurred by snow. These are not ordinary kills. Each animal is monument, mountain, a life layered with centuries of cycles. To strike one is to end not only a body, but a lineage stretching back into the ice ages. And yet the spear must be thrown. The persistence must continue. The hunter's chase, corner, strike. Flesh, bone, warmth, all necessary. And then, slowly, in the passing of years, the herds grow fewer. What once was countless herd becomes single shadow. And finally, none. The fossil record tells us this story without words. Bones buried in frozen earth mark the final presence of mammoth on tundras now empty. Isotope traces show diets stressed by warming climates, grasses thinning where once abundance grew. The advance of human persistence left cut marks upon the bones, undeniable scars of stone blades pressed against hide. Climate pressed from one side, hunger pressed from the other. Between these pressures, the giants of the Ice Age slipped into quiet absence. Imagine the memory of those hunters who lived long enough to see this change, to walk valleys where mammoths once moved like rivers of flesh, and find them empty. What thoughts did they carry, knowing their children would never again see those forms, never again hear the rumbling calls through snow-filled air? Was it relief, for danger diminished? Or was the silence heavier, a reminder not of triumph but of echo without return? Extinction is a ghostly teacher. It ensures that every success bears the shadow of loss. And maybe extinction shaped identity as much as survival did. To outlast the mammoth, the cave bear, the great sloth, is to inherit absence as companion. Humanity may have gained dominance, but what it carried with it was silence. A silence etched into landscapes that once thundered. Even now, we feel awe when looking at the tusk of a mammoth in a museum case. Not because we plan to hunt it, but because we know it is gone, forever. That knowledge lives like a scar in us, reminding that hunger can erase what cannot be replaced. Science gives us clarity but no comfort. Genetic data shows bottlenecks in populations, final remnants of herds marooned on isolated islands before fading away. Excavated camps layer animal bone after animal bone, revealing the slowing heartbeat of a species under pressure. Extinction is not instant. It is drawn out, stretching across generations, sometimes so quietly that only in hindsight does the finality appear. But the hunters must have noticed. They must have felt the emptiness when herds failed to arrive, when trails were bare, when one by one, the giants fell away like constellations blinking out of a once crowded sky. Could it be that the memory of these endings shaped the human mind just as much as the thrill of success? To carry food home is one kind of story. To carry silence home is another. Identity was carved not only in endurance, but in absences endured. The weight of knowing that some doors close and never open again may be the very root of our human sense of loss, of elegy, of longing for what was. The final mammoth was not just the end of a herd, it was perhaps the first ghost we knew, the first haunting of history. We still chase such ghosts. We imagine them in films, in books, in bones displayed beneath lights. We call them back in story and imagination, as if to repair absence, as if to resurrect a memory too heavy to let go. The fact that they do not return only deepens our longing, makes the silence louder. Extinction altered both our technologies and our philosophies. It taught us that survival carries cost, and that cost is sometimes the irreplaceable. And as we stand within our own era, watching species vanish under pressures of climate and invention, we cannot help but hear the echo of those long hunts. Once again, survival, this time industrial and vast, presses against the lives of others. Once again, climate shifts thread themselves into difficulty. The ghost of the mammoth lingers not as relic, but as mirror. It haunts us because its loss is not singular. It is pattern. Extinction is silence given shape. It tells us that every chase closes a door, and that some doors never open again. It teaches reciprocity, but also humility, that we are not only inheritors of survival, but also inheritors of absence. To survive is to remember both. And if so much can vanish, if entire worlds can close into silence, then what lessons remain in the fragments they left us? In fossil bones etched with cuts, in tools buried beside them, in the geologic script of survival preserved in stone? What stories lie waiting in the deep layers of earth, hinting to us how humans hunted and endured, long after prey and hunter are gone? The hunt itself is long vanished, but its traces still remain. Not in the flesh of animals, not in the breath of hunters, but in stone, in bone, in the quiet archives of the earth where nothing fully disappears. Fossils and artifacts keep their silence, but silence is not emptiness. It is memory stored differently, carved into matter rather than spoken in words. Each flake of flint, each scratch etched across bone, every faint isotopic shadow inside ancient tooth enamel. These are whispers of chases long ended, clues and questions together, fragments of ingenuity carried forward not by intention, but by geology's patience. Imagine a riverbank eroded after thousands of years of quiet flow. Within the loosened soil, a tool emerges, flint napped into a point, its edge still sharp, its surface still patterned with the rhythms of human hands. It has waited longer than memory, longer than story. And yet it is here, a fossil not of life but of thought, preserved in stone. Whoever once shaped it cannot speak to us, but the tool speaks for them. Its geometry holds the echo of survival. Each flake struck off a record of decisions, mistakes, persistence. It is both clue and question. We know it was held, but we do not know the story behind its last release. Cut-marked bones tell us even more. Beneath a microscope, grooves run across ancient ivory or mammoth rib, patterns as deliberate as script. Here is where sinew was stripped. Here is where marrow was split. Each incision a survival tactic, but also a memory, skilled hands repeating the same motion season after season. When archaeologists examine such bones, they see not only death, but the intelligent choreography of life. Tools scraping meat free in methodical lines reveal, thousands of years later, hunters who knew both need and patience. Such marks in fossil bone are reminders that ingenuity never fully vanishes. It lingers, etched into silence, waiting for someone to listen. Science has carried this hearing further still. Through isotope analysis, bones and teeth reveal hidden life stories, chemical signatures carried quietly within them. Carbon ratios tell us what plants dotted past landscapes. Oxygen isotopes speak of water consumed, of droughts and floods endured. Nitrogen reflects long migrations, diets rising or weakening with the availability of prey. In their chemistry, fossils record climate, hunger, abundance, and fate. Hunters may not have known the science, but they felt the consequence. Drought diminishing herds, cold lengthening the chase. What we study now in laboratories was once lived by them, written on their bodies and the bodies of what they pursued. Could it be that the earth itself is the true storyteller here? Fossils are its way of remembering, recording fleeting hunts with the patience of stone. Not because time intended to keep these memories, but because entropy does not erase evenly. Some bones decayed into nothing, but others mineralized, transformed into archives. Some voices were lost, but others became echoes we could still decipher. Beneath every sediment layer lies the world replaying itself, whispering that action always leaves residue, whether in ash, in isotope, or in scar upon stone. And yet every fossil is more question than answer. Who carved this flint and why was it left behind? Was it dropped hurriedly, or placed deliberately, or buried with a story now untold? Which hunt carved these bones with such careful incisions? Were they trophies, meals, or rituals? Fossils give us evidence, but they also remind us of the abyss between what remains and what is gone. The chase itself was breath, motion, sweat, desperation, patience, all of which evaporated into air. What remains is stone, mute and unyielding. In this silence, we are left to imagine. Perhaps it is this silence that haunts us most. Fossils remind us that we are always chasing memory, always piecing together what is incomplete. They whisper that survival's traces endure, but never in full form. To find an ancient bone or stone means stepping into narrative without closure, leaning into wonder, into speculation, into humility. For every answer a fossil provides, it presses more questions into our hands. Even so, these quiet remnants connect us to continuity. A flint fragment proves that someone once thought, and that their thought endured beyond their life. A chemical trace proves that drought once pressed a herd, just as climate presses us now. The endurance of these silent teachers bridges us to those ancient hunters, not as strangers, but as kin, made of the same desires, fears, and ingenuity. Stone and bone, preserved across millennia, prove that ingenuity itself can fossilize. And perhaps that is the deeper mystery, that survival is more than breath, more than body. It is the capacity to leave memory behind, however faint, however fractured. Every fossil, every tool, every isotope line in bone is evidence that we are remembered, sometimes without meaning to be. The earth keeps its archive faithfully, carrying within each layer both silence and story. And if these remains can whisper so clearly of what came before, then one final thought arrives, unresolved. What of our own traces? What fossils of us will remain? What tools, what fragments, what strange materials might lie millions of years from now, carrying memory of this age into silence? Every age leaves its archive in the earth. Stone tools once littered the banks of rivers. Obsidian points lay buried beside campfires now long collapsed, and bones scored with cut marks became silent signals of survival. Today, those traces linger in museums and beneath soil, giving us windows into the lives of hunters who came before. Yet even now, in our own time, we leave behind remnants that will one day press themselves into the slow ledger of geology, artifacts of plastic, alloy, and steel, scattered into sediments, drifting toward the destiny of becoming technofossils. If the earth remembers by sediment, then we must wonder what memories of us it will choose to keep. Imagine a broken arrowhead of molded plastic, lost in a forest during a modern hunt. To the hand that held it, it was ordinary, cheap, replaceable, disposable. Yet when dropped into soil, it refused to decay. Centuries may pass, forests may burn or regrow, but the polymer will linger, pressed slowly deeper until rock enfolds it. One day, perhaps far beyond our own imagining, a shard of it will be discovered by other eyes. It will no longer be arrow or tool or weapon. It will be fossil, preserved in the same quiet way as flint, yet carrying a different story, a story not of necessity, but of abundance, of mass production, of lives where permanence outlives use. Steel traps, too, scatter in silence. Some rust into soil, merging with iron already present in the earth. Others survive longer, alloys resisting decay. Like mammoth bones, they hold cuts, scars, signs of use. But unlike those earlier relics, they arrive not as rare tokens but as countless repetitions. A cage here, a spring there, buried and forgotten. The future soil will record them with indifference, layering them beside shells, beside pollen, beside traces of volcanic ash. The moment they captured will be lost, but their form will remain, etched into time long after memory fades. Alloys and synthetics, plastics and bullets, wires and cartridges. All of these are modern extensions of the same human instinct, to craft tools that extend reach, to shape matter into survival. Yet here lies a haunting difference. The flint point dissolves back into the geology from which it came. The carved bone needle eventually becomes soil once more. Our technofossils resist. They persist in unnatural longevity, whispering back not only of ingenuity but of imbalance, of material that cannot return easily into cycle. The earth will remember us, but perhaps not kindly. Science has already named this age the Anthropocene, a geological epoch defined not by climate alone, but by human presence etched into stone. Plastic has entered rock, fusing into plastiglomerates, strange hybrids of polymer and basalt. Lead isotopes trace the expansion of industry into every ice core. Carbon shifts mark combustion faster than natural cycles would allow. If those who come long after us read the rock, they will not struggle to see our mark. Like flint scattered in Paleolithic fields, our tools are already writing themselves into strata. And what will they conclude when they read those layers? Will they see hunters whose ingenuity created weapons finer and finer, until efficiency became excess? Will they see cooperation written in mass production, or disconnection written in waste? A single stone blade tells of one hand against hunger. A billion plastic fragments may tell of a species outpaced by its own invention. Our technofossils will not be silent witnesses of necessity, but charged reminders of decisions. Perhaps this is philosophy as much as science. To imagine ourselves as fossils is to place ourselves into humility. We too will be sediment one day. Our tools are artifacts. Our ruins will mix with shells and pollen, just as mammoth tusks once lay among river stones. Could it be that the earth itself is always archivist, writing down everything it is given, whether bone or alloy, whether gratitude or neglect? Every age becomes inscription. Each flake, each fragment becomes text for readers who will never know us. Even now, as hunters move through fields with rifles, with compound bows, with scopes and cartridges, the ground beneath already envisions how it will remember them. A bullet casing here, brass weathered into soil. A knife of steel left forgotten in woods. Each on its own is ordinary. Together, they are chorus, a record of how ingenuity cannot help but leave residue. Earth absorbs it quietly, without judgment, layering future cliffs with what we leave behind. And perhaps we should wonder at this inheritance. The stone points of our ancestors remind us of patience and survival. The bone tools remind us of reverence and mortality. The technofossils of today might whisper of excess, of innovation unmoored from necessity. Yet even that is story, even that is memory, preserved the way all things are, quietly, steadily, without hurry, within the breathing layers of the ground. In the end, the question is not whether the earth will remember us. It will. The deeper question is how. For memory is not neutral and geology is honest. It records not only what endured, but what resisted balance. Our technofossils will be the proof. And if the last spear points, the last nets, the last arrows were stories of survival, then our plastics and alloys may become stories of imbalance. Still survival, but survival written with louder scars. And yet, the earth will layer them all side by side, without separation, without disdain. Bone needles and steel wires will share the same rock. Obsidian blades and plastic arrowheads will lie together in sediment. In that archive, our history collapses into one long, intricate story. The tale of a species always hunting, forever shaping matter, forever leaving traces behind. And if we imagine the future readers of our technofossils, whoever or whatever they might be, perhaps they, too, will feel what we feel when holding a flint chip in hand: wonder, humility, and the quiet knowledge that all survival turns into artifact. That all hunger, all ingenuity, all existence is destined, at last, to become memory embedded in stone. The hunt has always been more than pursuit. Beneath each strategy, fire, ambush, nets, arrows, there lingers something deeper, something that transcends the body's hunger or the stomach's need. It is rhythm, metaphor, memory. It is the echo of one existence chasing another, the endless exchange between presence and absence. In the beginning, we may imagine it was only the mammoth or the antelope that mattered, but behind every chase lay another quarry. The fear of silence, the desire for meaning, the hope that something of us, something of our movement across the earth, would remain after the dust of the day settled. Imagine the lineages of hunters stretching across ages. One set of eyes following silhouettes across grass, another crouched in reeds, another listening for hoofbeats in snow. Each believed the chase was for survival, and in part it was. But underneath survival lay something else: continuity. To hunt was to join the story of those who had chased before and those who would follow. The acts repeated themselves so often they became echoes, reverberations stretching not only through time but through memory itself. The earth carried these echoes quietly in its own archive. Tools of flint left upon riverbanks, bone carved into harpoons, traps embedded into soils. All became notes of a song too vast to hear in its completeness. Layer by layer, sediment wrote them into permanence. Each fossil, every cut mark, every preserved isotope was a syllable, a breath, a reminder that to chase was never simply action. It was inscription. The earth was always listening, always recording. Our hunts became its memory, but perhaps the truest prey was never animal alone. Perhaps we have always hunted for certainty against the unraveling, hunted for pattern against the chaos of entropy. Every stalking step, every patient silence crouched beneath the grass, every fire directed toward herd or cliff. These were defenses against the fear that nothing lasts, that absence always wins. By framing our survival as chase, we created meaning. The prey was body, but it was also silence, silence that threatened to erase memory if we let go. Science and story converge in this thought. The isotopes trapped in tooth enamel speak of climate cycles, yes, but they also whisper that our ancestors noticed change long before we had tools to measure it. The flint points scattered across continents tell us of technique, yes, but they also echo identity, a recognition that the world remembered their hands as much as their breath. Even technofossils of our present age, plastic arrowheads and steel traps drifting into soil, extend this echo, though in tones less gentle, less ephemeral. Earth keeps them all. The hunt, in any form, is never lost. It reverberates into geology, into sediment, into future. And so the metaphor grows. We hunted for food, but also for belonging. We hunted for fire, but also for story. We hunted companionship in wolves, foresight in stars, patience in cycles of herds. Every act of pursuit was doubled. Body driven by hunger, spirit driven by meaning. Perhaps this is what makes us human. Not that we kill, not that we survive, but that in every strike or silence we also weave memory, also craft echoes into the world around us. What if the hunt itself was ceremony of existence? Each chase a rehearsal for the fact that life is temporary. Each return of prey both triumph and elegy. The mammals we once followed are gone now, their bones scattered, their names embedded in strata we read like scripture. Yet in their absence, we continue to chase. Not their bodies, but their memory, their echo. Museums, stories, cave paintings, all of these are hunts of another kind. We seek what was lost. We pursue it through image and reconstruction, ensuring the silence left behind never seals itself fully. Extinction, climate, invention, each layered their own lessons into this endless metaphor. The mammoth's absence haunted us, reshaping ceremony into elegy. The bough's whisper taught us that silence can be sharper than noise. Ice and fire alike taught us patience, taught us humility. Each of these was strategy but also metaphor, proof that survival was never flat, never simple. Each act contained philosophy, hidden just beneath the surface of necessity. And so, at the edge of this story, the hunt seems less about predator and prey, and more about dialogue. To hunt was to converse with Earth itself, listening to rivers, watching shadows, reading migrations, deciphering echoes of cliffs, attending to fire's unruly breath. Each chase revealed that the world was not backdrop, but partner. The herds taught movement, the predators taught caution, the caves taught resonance, the tides taught rhythm. We hunted, but we were also being taught what persistence meant, what patience required, what memory demanded. Even now, the echoes continue. We no longer follow mammoths, yet we hunt knowledge, we hunt meaning in fossils, in layers of rock, in the patterns of deep time. Archaeologists sift bones the way hunters once sifted tracks, chasing not prey but story. Writers, scientists, dreamers, all continue this ancient motion. To follow absence as if it still breathes, to bring echoes forth from silence, to ensure memory survives. And here, perhaps, lies the revelation. The hunt has never ceased. It has only changed its quarry. From bodies of flesh to bodies of story, from food to meaning, from survival to remembrance. The mammoth was never the only target. The truest prey was always silence, the fear that nothing would remain after the chase ended. Every tool, every strategy, every ritual was designed to fight that silence, to leave echo after echo pressed into earth. The hunt becomes metaphor because life itself is pursuit. Pursuit of sustenance, of belonging, of understanding, of memory that resists the tide of forgetting. What remains now are echoes, the footprints written into stone, the scars etched into bone, the faint presence of our strategies buried beneath soil. They remind us of the continuity of our chase, of a dialogue unbroken across millennia. And as we close this journey, we recognize that to hunt was never simply to take life, but to make meaning. We hunted not only animals, but time itself, leaving behind echoes shaped into stone, fire, and story. We stand here because of those chases, because of those echoes, because silence never won completely. And perhaps that is the truest legacy, to know that what endures is not the body of prey, but the resonance of memory, pulsing still across the earth like breath left behind, like footsteps pressed into soil that never entirely forgets.